It is the year 1235. Julian, a Hungarian Dominican friar, has arrived in the lands he calls Magna Hungaria, the original homeland of the Hungarian people. After a lengthy journey from Hungary to Constantinople, and then over the western Eurasian steppe, he travelled east of the meeting point of the Volga and Kama rivers. There, Julian met a people he called pagan Hungarians, or Bashkirds by others. Julian believed them to be the remnants of the Magyars who never came to Hungary. According to his report, their languages were still mutually intelligible despite centuries of separation. But Julian's joy at the discovery was short-lived. Only a few days away, a great army gathered on the borders of Magna Hungaria, reinforcements arriving every day. Its messengers demanded the Bashkirds and their neighbours submit to them. Soon after Julian's departure, Magna Hungaria was overrun. Julian returned to Hungary, and then on to Rome, bringing with him news of the events in the east. He was soon sent back to resume his mission, arriving in the Rus city of Vladimir Suzdal in the summer of 1237. There, the local prince, Yuri, received messengers bearing letters of submission from the great army. As one of the letters was for the Hungarian king, Yuri passed it on to Julian, who carried it with him back to Hungary. Narrow was this escape, for only a few weeks after leaving Vladimir, it was destroyed. In Hungary, the letter was read out to the king, Bela, in a threat that has echoed down the ages. I, Khan, the emissary of the heavenly king, to whom he gave power over the earth to lift up those who subject themselves to me and lay low those who resist, am amazed at you, King of Hungary, that when I will have sent you envoys 30 times, you do not send any of them back to me, and send me neither your messengers nor letters. I know that you are a wealthy and powerful king, and that you have many soldiers under you, and alone you rule a great kingdom. And, therefore, it is difficult for you to submit yourself to me voluntarily. However, it would be better and more beneficial if you were to voluntarily submit to me. I have understood, in addition, that you are keeping the Cumans, my slaves, under your protection, for which reason I command you not to keep them with you any longer, and do not have me as your enemy because of them. It is easier for them to escape than you, because they, lacking houses and migrating about with tents, might perhaps get away. But you, living in houses, having castles and cities, how will you escape my hands? Brother Julian's letters brought warning of the approach of the Mongol Empire, its armies having overrun everything in their path. And now, the Khan was demanding the submission of the King of Hungary. His kingdom, and indeed all of Europe, were now the targets of the Mongols. In the 13th century, one state came to dominate most of the world. Within decades of its founding, the Mongol Empire stretched across the Eurasian continent. The horsemen of the Great Khan carried his will from the coast of the Pacific Ocean, across China and the Islamic world, and in their furthest westernmost grasp into the heart of Europe. In 1236, the Mongols conquered Magna Hungaria, and then the Volga Bulgars. The next year, they began to attack the Rus principalities. By winter 1240, Mongol armies had taken Kiev, and within a few weeks had crossed the Carpathian Mountains to enter the Kingdom of Hungary. In April 1241, in battles fought only days apart, the Mongols destroyed major armies of Poland and Hungary. The Hungarian king was forced to flee for his life. In the minds of many, it seemed Europe was helpless, ready to be seized by the Mongols, only for their armies to suddenly, and seemingly mysteriously, pull back. Many say it was the death of the Great Khan who forced their retreat, others that the task was too daunting. The story is a familiar one, but recent research has filled in the gaps on this famous event. No longer shrouded in legend, historians and archaeologists have compiled written sources from across Europe, Asia, and the Mongol Empire, alongside the physical remains of the invasion, to dispel many of the myths that built up about it like so much rust. In cooperation with a team of leading experts on the Mongol invasions of Europe, Professors Josef Laszlowski, Balazs Nej, Stephen Pao and others, Kings and Generals proudly shares with you the most up-to-date understanding of the Mongol invasion of Hungary, combining research from around the world, archaeological remains, and new scientific data. From the inception of the invasion to the Battle of Mohi, its effects on the Hungarian population, to the infamous withdrawal from Europe in 1242, we will address common myths and construct the fullest picture ever created of one of the most dramatic tales in history. The Mongol invasion of Europe and the Battle of Mohi is a well-attested historical event. Not only do numerous chronicles, charters, letters, and other sources from across Europe describe the invasion in various detail, but we have the accounts of men like Master Roger. He was an archdeacon who was captured by the Mongols during the invasion and spent some time as their prisoner. His eyewitness report forms one of the most important sources for the recreation of the Mongols' movements and operations in Hungary, a powerful first-hand account of the ravages of the campaign.
Franciscan monk John Plano of Carpini was sent by the papal court to the great Khan of the Mongols. And after his return, he produced one of the finest piece of descriptions on the Mongol Empire.
And there are detailed descriptions about their journey, and they also describe that what did they see in the heart of Mongolia, in Karakorum. They also witnessed the coronation of Guyuk, the next great Khan of the Mongols. There are other envoys who went to the Middle Eastern Mongolian courts, and they also have their description. These were the first encounters with this Eastern nation.
Mongol invasion and the arrival of the Mongols, it was a very strong news, very strong information in contemporary Europe. Matthew Paris, who was a Benedictine monk in the monastery of Ely, not far from London, he, in his chronicle, recorded very many quite authentic details of the proceedings, of the arrival, of the events. He included letters, for example, to his work as well. So basically, I think it is interesting to see that the arrival of the Mongols and their advance was a very important news for the whole territory of Western Latin Christianity.
The Mongols evidently had their own, now lost, official report of the campaign. This became the basis for descriptions of the event in official histories the Mongols sponsored across their empire. The Great World History, written around 1300 by the Ilkhanat's vizier and historian Rashid al-Din, gives a detailed Persian-language Mongol point of view of the campaign. In China, an official history compiled in 1370 from Mongolian sources translated into Chinese, the Yuan Shi, records the campaign through biographies of some of the Mongols who took part. In the biography of the greatest Mongol general, Sube'etei, the Battle of Mohi is described, making it the first battle on European soil to be described in a Chinese source. In the earliest surviving Mongolian language source, the mid-13th century Secret History of the Mongols, the Western Campaign is one of the principal events recorded. It is a dramatic episode which serves to explain the fallout between the leading Mongol princes, Batu and Guyuk. Here it is known as the Kipchak Campaign, as the Mongols had seen the primary purpose as the subjugation of the nomadic Turkic Kipchak peoples who inhabited the western steppes. The Christian peoples westwards of the Kipchak receive only brief, indirect mention, merely a statement of them being fierce fighters with sharp swords.
The Secret History of the Mongols is the most important source of the whole Mongol Empire and the early history of the Mongol Empire. Internal sources are very important, and it's a really unique source because practically Mongol literacy begins with the secret history of the Mongols. All of a sudden, it appears, and it's perfect historical, epical work of the history of the Mongols. It contains all the tribal legends, all the genealogies of the Mongol tribes, and it gives a very trustworthy description of the events taking place in the first decades of the Mongol Empire.
But increasingly, a great volume of archaeological detail has shown aspects of the campaign beyond the written word. Remnants of abandoned villages, their slain populations left unburied, burned ruins where a family huddled in a home, or desperate last stands around fortified churches in the Great Hungarian Plain. Arrowheads and other weaponry of steppe origin abound. Coupled with charter and chronicle data, it allows us to build a fuller picture not just of the movement of Mongol armies, but what the invasion looks like for the people of the Carpathian Basin who experienced it.
After a while, it turned out that we have got quite a lot of sites with direct evidence of destruction. Really burned down buildings, half bodies, massacred people, and things like that. The second is the scale of these excavations, the number of these excavations. So it's pure statistics. During these last 2 decades, more settlements have been excavated than in the previous 100 years. And the size of these excavations was much, much bigger than ever before. And these new finds, many of them are connected to deserted, destroyed villages, looted churches from the 13th century.
Many presentations of the invasion of Hungary and the Battle of Mohi have relied on popular narratives written in the 20th century. Others are coloured by nationalistic desires to turn it into a discussion of Christian heroism, or to present the Mongols as unstoppable conquerors, unrestrained by human weakness. In this project, we will focus on what is told to us by both the historical sources and the physical remains. First, we must explain what drove the Mongols to attack the Hungarian kingdom, a target over 5,000 kilometers from the Mongolian homeland. Our story begins back in the Mongolian steppe. The steppe is a term for a wide belt of dry grassland that runs from Hungary across today's Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. Until the modern era, it had been dominated by nomadic peoples like the Mongols, who migrated between winter and summer pastures with their great herds of horse, sheep, goat, cattle, and camels. They practiced war as highly mobile horse archers, wielding powerful composite recurve bows.
The Mongols themselves are the heirs of a long tradition in Eurasia. So the famous nomadic empires established long before the Mongolian Empire in the 13th century were the predecessors of that culture and lifestyles the Mongols still maintain. If you go to Mongolia and visit the countryside and go to the yurts, to herders, you can experience a very similar lifestyle as it was several thousand years ago, I would say.
The nomadic lifestyle is a very hard lifestyle. Living in Eurasia is not an easy life because the summers are relatively hot, but the winters are extremely cold. And usually the nomads spend their whole summer to feed their animals. So they are try to find places the animals can eat grass. Depending on which part of Eurasia they are, it's depending how much they have to nomadize. So the winter time is the period when the men have enough free time to invade other nations. So this is one of the main reasons why the Mongols usually attacked the other nations during winter time, because by the time the horses were well fed and the The rivers were frozen, so it was very easy to cross the rivers.
For the past 2,000 years, the steppe has been home to many of history's great empires and the most powerful states of the Middle Ages, from the Xiongnu to the mighty Khaganate of the Gokturks. At the start of the 13th century, the Mongols under Genghis Khan continued in this tradition to form the greatest of all nomadic empires, at its height dominating most of Eurasia, from Central Europe to the Pacific Ocean and borders of India. In 1206, Genghis Khan, or more properly in Mongolian, Chinggis Khan, established the Mongol Empire. While it is popular to claim, it does not seem that Chinggis envisioned world conquest at the outset of his reign. But by the time of his death in 1227, his armies had conquered much of northern China and Central Asia, met with victory upon victory, and traveling even to the borders of India. The Mongols began to understand their mission. Heaven had decreed Chinggis Khan not just ruler of the Mongols, but of the world. For what else but a heavenly mandate could explain such success? After Chinggis Khan's death, he was succeeded by his third son Ögedei as Khan of the Mongol Empire. In the historical records, Ögedei often appears a more jovial fellow than his stern father and siblings. A sociable, generous man with a deep love for alcohol, Ögedei showed willingness to compromise and seek solutions. He sought to encourage trade to the Mongol homeland, even building a permanent capital for the empire, Karakorum, situated in Mongolia's Ohun Valley and close to the site of former Turkic capitals. Despite this, Ögedei must not be misunderstood. There can be no doubt of his commitment to his belief in Mongol imperial destiny and willingness to use mass violence to that end. On his orders, conquests were resumed with greater fervor than ever before.
He was actually a talented conqueror, and he was a talented Khan. He had a sort of charismatic leadership. Al-Karshi describes him as a lion in the assembly meetings. And you can interpret that in all kinds of ways. He had this ambition in 1235 to set out and conquer in every direction, east, west, north, south. They had made this decision in 1235 to take the priority task of conquering the west.
By 1234, the Mongols had completed their conquest of northern China, destroying the Jin dynasty, the ancestral foes of Chinggis Khan's family. The following year, a grand assembly, known as a Hurultai, was held at the Mongol capital of Karakorum. There, the Mongol princes and generals imbibed vast quantities of alcohol and planned the next round of conquests. Campaigns were organized against southern China, Korea, and most importantly for our story, plans for a conquest of Western Asia. The campaigns were envisioned as a massive series of pincer movements. At that time, one Mongol army was already in the process of consolidating the conquest of Iran and the Caucasus. To accompany it, it was decided for a northern force to overrun the western part of the Eurasian steppes, the Rus peoples, and perhaps as far as Hungary. This was to be the Great Western Campaign of the Mongols. To the Mongols, the enemies they would face in the west were already known. To fully understand Mongol preparations for the invasion into Europe in the 1240s, we must travel over 15 years earlier. Batu's grandfather, Chinggis Khan, led the first major Mongol invasion westwards. His target was the Empire of Khwarezm in Central Asia. As Chinggis Khan's armies overran the Khwarezmian borders, its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, fled for his life. Chinggis dispatched armies under his generals Jibba Noyan and Subadei to pursue him. The younger of these two generals, Subadei, will be an important figure throughout this story. While Subadei is the most famous of all Mongolian generals, in time leading armies all over Eurasia, in 1220 he was still early in his career.
In 1212, he ascended the wall of one of the Jin Empire's cities. And even though this is not typical nomad cavalry tactics, this was a way to stand out and catch the attention of Genghis Khan, to do something on foot, climbing up ladders, fighting your way to the top, and he was recognized by Genghis Khan for this, and that set him on a path of promotion.
Subaday's family had long been followers of Genghis Khan's, and his father had provided aid to Genghis Khan during a low point in his wars to unify the Mongolian plateau. After this, Subaday's older brother was appointed by the Khan as a commander of 100 in the Mongol army, while Subaday was enrolled into the Keshig, the imperial bodyguard of the Khan. Alongside physically protecting the Khan, his family, his personal possessions and herds, members of the Keshig acted as the Khan's servants and household, down to preparing his meals and musical instruments. At the same time, they were the core administrators of the empire, who could wield vast authority. Besides all this, they were trained to take on more significant military roles. Wining, dining and fighting together with their Khan, this close connection and rich reward system made the men of the Keshig some of the most elite warriors of their era, supremely and utterly loyal to the great Khan.
So the Keshig was essentially the bodyguard around Genghis Khan. And it started out quite small, but it was ballooning as the years went by and into the reign of Ogedai, because it was, for members of the Keshig, it was a chance for high social advancement in the military aristocracy of the Mongol Empire. Fathers would try to get their sons into this Keshig, and Subutai was one of these characters. He was not really exceptional. There's no guarantee he was going to be a great general, but he had joined the Keshig at about the age of maybe 25. He was just one of essentially a draft pool of Mongol officers, but figures like him got promoted based on their demonstrated valor, judgment in war.
Subutai was a minor figure at first, but with his Keshig training, he was soon marked out for his cunning, fearlessness, and utter devotion to Genghis Khan. His first prominent command role was in 1216, partnered with Chinggis's oldest son, Jochi. In 1220, he was made the junior commander to Jebe, Genghis Khan's top general, and leader of some of the Khan's most heavily armored, experienced troops. Jebe must have acted as a sort of mentor to Subutai, training him in the field to be the sword of the Khan wielded against his enemies. When Chinggis ordered them to pursue Hazem Shah Muhammad in 1220, both Jebe and Subutai were prepared to run to the end of the earth for their Khan. Shah Muhammad led Jebe and Subutai on a lengthy chase across northern Iran and the Caucasus, before he succumbed to illness in the last days of 1220. Freed from their task and receiving permission from Chinggis Khan to continue operations, Jebe and Subutai began to take the submission of cities across northwestern Iran and the Caucasus. They battled the Georgians and all manner of local peoples before exiting the mountains into the western Eurasian steppe between the Black and Caspian Seas. In the 12th and 13th centuries, most of the steppe west of Mongolia was inhabited by Turkic-speaking nomads, known as the Kuman Kipchaks. This collection of often feuding peoples were commonly employed as mercenaries by neighboring powers.
Turkic tribal confederacy, which lived mainly on the territory what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, North Caucasus, but also a considerable part of western Kazakhstan. We can't say it was an empire, it was rather a loose confederacy of nomadic tribes. They spoke Turkic languages. The Kuman or Kipchak term, actually if we say the Kuman Confederacy or the Kipchak Confederacy, actually we speak of the same thing. At least in the 12th century, they were always completely united.
After his unification of Mongolia in 1206, some of Chinggis Khan's enemies, the Merkit people, fled west to seek shelter with the Kipchaks east of the Caspian Sea. In 1216, Chinggis had sent his son Jochi along with Subutai in pursuit of the Merkit. There they fought a series of battles with the Kipchaks, beginning a serious feud, as the Mongols began to see them as powerful foes, marked out for later conquest as punishment for harboring the Khan's enemies. Several years later, in 1222, Chinggis saw an opportunity for Jubba and Sube'etei to take the submission of more of the Kipchak people with a surprise attack from the south after Hazem Shah Muhammad's death. Thus, Jubba and Sube'etei entered the steppes north of the Caucasus Mountains, defeated a coalition of Kipchaks and Alan peoples, then pursued the remaining Kipchaks west. Many sought shelter with the princes of the Rus principalities. The Rus-Kipchak relationship was a complex one. It was complicated by the fact that there was no single Rus or Kipchak state, but numerous independent princes, of sometimes shared or competing interests among both groups. While at times the Rus and Kipchak princes were fierce foes, others developed trade and military connections, with the Rus valuing the Kipchaks as allies and purchasing their horses for war, sometimes cementing their cooperation through marriage alliances or baptism for the Kipchaks. Therefore, when a large body of Kipchak troops fled to the Rus lands, in rather quick succession, the Rus princes gathered their armies and accompanied the Kipchak hosts against the Mongols. The Mongols sent emissaries to the Rus to give them an opportunity to abandon the Kipchaks, for the Khan had yet no quarrel with them. The three leading Rus princes of the coalition, all named Mstislav, made the poor decision to execute the Mongol envoys. A second group of Mongol envoys later arrived, simply to assert that the Rus had just declared war on the Mongol Empire. Over the following days, small skirmishes took place between the Rus Kipchak cavalry and the Mongols. In one of these clashes, a contested theory by Stephen Pao suggests that Jubba Noyan was captured and killed by the Rus Kipchak allies. This forced Sube'etei into his first totally independent command, thousands of kilometers from reinforcements and vastly outnumbered.
I think Jebbe Noyan, the senior Mongol commander, was killed shortly before the battle. So under this immense pressure, Sube'etei had to take the reins of leadership.
It makes it even more remarkable that Sube'etei was afterward able to pull off one of the most famous military maneuvers of all time, leading the Rus Kipchak forces on a feigned retreat for over a week. Once the Rus Kipchak forces began to lose cohesion, Sube'etei fell upon them. The result was the clash at the Kalka River in May 1223, where Sube'etei destroyed the Rus Kipchak coalition.
And he did and won this major turnaround victory at the Kalka, where a number of the premier Rus princes were rounded up and executed in various ways, including some of them unfortunately getting placed under benches and floors, and the Mongols had a feast on top of them.
Though Sube'etei had been victorious over the Rus and Kipchak, he began to withdraw back to the Mongol Empire. His army was outnumbered, exhausted, and unsupported, in no position for further new conquests in the distant west. Unfortunately for Sube'etei, during his return journey, his army was ambushed by yet another people, the Turkic-speaking Muslim Bulgars of the Volga River. Suffering yet another setback, the Great Raid, as it's so often called, was not highly regarded in the sources of the Mongol Empire. In the Mongol imperial accounts, the entire campaign goes either totally unmentioned or is condensed into a brief, laconic statement, as in the Secret History of the Mongols, where it simply notes that Sube'etei had been put in a difficult position by the people of the West. For Sube'etei, he had lost his mentor Jubba and had suffered at best an inconclusive campaign, at worst a series of humiliating defeats. Yet this had provided useful information on the status and strengths of these armies in the West. The several 100-kilometer-long campaign and experience hardened him, forging him into the iron-shod and merciless general he became known to history as. For the next decade, he nursed revenge in his heart. As a result of Jubba and Sube'etei's campaign, the Mongol leadership was under the impression that the western end of the continent was home to fierce foes. Chinese sources report how Chinggis Khan considered the Kipchak one of the empire's greatest threats. As nomads, they knew how to fight like the Mongols, and if they were able to unite, then they could be serious rivals. In the secret history of the Mongols, one of Chinggis Khan's sons, Sagadai, gave a stern warning about the people of the West during preparations for the Great Campaign. The enemy people beyond consist of many states, and there, at the end of the world, they are hard people. They are people who, when they become angry, would rather die by their own swords. I am told they have sharp swords. The Mongols believed it would take overwhelming force to crush their new foes in the West. Thus, in 1235, thorough preparations were made, undoubtedly with constant and close consultation with Sube'etei and other informants, particularly the merchants, who the Mongols richly overpaid for wares and intel. This campaign was no sideshow, but a unified effort, with all branches of the Mongol ruling dynasty contributing troops. The chief figures of the third generation of Chinggisids were all present.
Chagatai, the brother of Ogadai, proposed that all the princely family members should send their eldest son. And that means that they'll be bringing their personal retinues with them, and it will create, as Chagatai said, an army like never before.
Of Chinggis Khan's deceased oldest son Jochi's line, most of his numerous children took part, especially his oldest and most important sons, Orda, Berke, Shiban, and Tenkut. Most famous and important was Batu. He was Jochi's second son, and considered the heir to his late father. For Batu, this campaign was an invaluable chance to prove himself. His father, Jochi, had been the firstborn son of Chinggis Khan, and it seems for a time considered as the great conqueror's favoured heir to succeed him. Yet throughout his life, an uncertainty had lain about Jochi's paternity. Some 2 decades before the establishment of the Mongol Empire, Chinggis Khan's wife, Berta, had been captured by the Merkit people, a rival people from northern Mongolia. Though Chinggis campaigned against the Merkit and freed his wife, the rescue was darkened by the fact that she was pregnant with a boy. It was unclear if the father was Chinggis or the temporary Merkit husband forced upon her. When the boy was born, he was named Jochi, meaning guest. Though Chinggis always treated him as his true-born son and considered him fully legitimate, the shadow of doubt remained.
But Chinggis, after a family quarrel, when the Chinggis children had a great quarrel, and Chagatai called Jochi a bastard who is not accepted by the family, then Chinggis was very resolute and said, "No, he's my son, and don't speak about it any further." So, although genetically, most probably was not a Chinggisid, but it was accepted throughout centuries as the legitimate ancestor of the westernmost branch, the Jochid branch of the Chinggisids.
Near the end of Jochi's life, the doubt was raised again by his younger brother, Sagadai, resulting in a falling out between the brothers. Chinggis Khan removed both Jochi and Sagadai from the succession, which instead passed to his third son, Ugadei. Jochi was distraught and spent the remainder of his life apart from his family. He died in uncertain circumstances in 1225 or 1227, with accusations that Chinggis had his son poisoned swirling around some parts of Asia. On Jochi's death, Chinggis had confirmed Jochi's second son, Batu, as ruler of most of the lands that had been assigned to Jochi, which constituted most of today's Kazakhstan and Russia east of the Ural Mountains.
When Jochi died, he had 2 sons, of course not 2, lots of sons, more than 40, but 2 who had the legitimacy. The senior was Orda, and the other one was Batu. It's interesting, and we don't know the real reasons, but from the first moment onwards, Batu was accepted even by Orda, although he was the senior, as the leading personality. And Batu really, fulfilled those efforts which were begun by Genghis and then by Jochi. That is, the westernmost Mongol Empire was actually founded by Batu and by his campaigns.
Batu desired greatly to be the master of this region. He spent the years before the Great Campaign already fighting to secure his lands against rebelling Kipchaks and steadily expanding towards the Volga Bulgars. Batu saw the Great Campaign as a chance not just to expand his own personal holdings even further west, but also to confirm his own position, establishing his rightful place in the hierarchy of the empire. As the senior prince on the campaign, Batu had tremendous influence on its course, and it was a chance to prove himself a great commander, and thereby remove some of the shame around his father that still clung to Batu and left a barrier between his cousins.
And the west was supposed to go to Jochi and his descendants. So the supreme commander of the war against Hungary in the west was Batu, who was Jochi's successor as the ruler of the west, what would become the Golden Horde. And so he was the senior prince, but then you had representatives of all four branches of the family taking part in this campaign.
From Chinggis Khan's second son Tsagadai's line came his son Baidar and grandson Buri. Of the reigning Khan Ögedei went his sons Guyuk and Hadan, and representing his youngest brother, the late Tolui, went Mongke and his half-brother Böcek. Kulgen, a son of Chinggis Khan from a secondary wife, accompanied them, as did Subutai. Subutai was to be the top non-royal commander of the army. This was a chance to utilize his experience already gained in the west, alongside an opportunity to get his revenge for the difficulties suffered and death of Jibba. Great Khan Ögedei had wished to lead this army himself, but was talked out of it, for it was deemed too dangerous an expedition, and Ögedei's health may have already declined past being fit for such a trek. The army was expected to travel hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers, and to be gone for years. The aged and alcoholic Ögedei would not have fared well on such a journey. Each of these princes brought the troops attached to their households and appanages, resulting in a massive and diverse army. Common estimates range from 100 to 150,000 men, largely Mongolian and Turkic horse archers, but with an important contingent of Chinese siege engineers. Representatives of other conquered peoples joined them: Tanguts, Uyghurs, Khitan, Jurchen, already conquered Kipchaks, and even Central Asian Iranic-speaking peoples. It was mainly a cavalry army. Speed, maneuverability, and overwhelming firepower its strength, taking advantage of the seemingly unlimited pasture of the Great Eurasian Steppe. At one point in the planning process, we are told of plans to send a vast army of Han Chinese along with the main host, but this idea was talked down. Ögedei's advisor, Yulu Chutsai, declared they were unfit for the climate and long march. What were the army's actual objectives? The Kipchak and Bulgars were obviously targets, with the Rus to be punished for allying with them. And for the Mongols, punishment meant conquest. In general, the Western Steppe was to be incorporated into the Great Mongol State. But there is some suggestion that Hungary was a definite target from the outset, as we will see in a few minutes. Thus, the army, representing the four branches of the Chinggisid dynasty, had a goal to essentially conquer everything westwards, specifically intending on Europe as a part of this. After the Hurultai, the princes returned to their own territories to assemble their forces. The various armies marched separately, setting out in spring 1236 to unite on the Kama River, on the edge of Volga-Bulgar territory. In a thorough campaign from 1236 through to 1240, the Bulgars, Kipchaks, Alans, Mordvins, the Crimean Peninsula, and the Rus principalities fell in rapid succession and to great slaughter.
Batu's campaign against the Rus essentially was over the winter of 1237-38. Really in a few short months, the Mongols stormed through the network of cities and razed a lot of them to the ground and massacred the populations. The thing was that Rus fortifications were primarily wood and so earthworks and then a wooden palisade. And Mongol siege technology could blast holes in these walls, and then they'd of course do the storming of the breach, and this was massively successful. Also, the buildings were overwhelmingly wood in Rus cities, and the Mongols had a sort of a naphtha technology. I won't discuss, it's too obscene to discuss it, but they would manage to light these cities on fire, and so they were amazingly successful.
Summers were spent resting men and horses in the steppe, before resuming the campaign in the winter, crossing frozen rivers that were otherwise great obstacles. It should not be imagined that the campaign was without its difficulties. Kulgen, a son of Chinggis, was killed in battle against the Rus. Several settlements resisted fiercely and inflicted heavy losses on the Mongol besiegers before they were overcome.
Kulgen, this is not often talked about, but Kulgen was Chinggis Khan's son. He was one of the participants in this war. He was not a son of Berta, but he was still a very high-ranking fellow, and he was killed in the vicinity of Moscow, or Kolomna, close by on the Oka River. And we only have a very terse report of his death, but we can imagine that this would have been truly shocking, that a son of Chinggis Khan had died in the fighting.
One of the more significant blows to the army's strength that it suffered was not a military defeat. Sometime in the second half of 1240, the princes Mungke and Guyuk departed the campaign back for Mongolia, taking their forces with them, perhaps 20,000 men, assuming each commanded a tumen. This reduced the strength of the army, which had suffered losses incurred from 4 continuous years of campaign.
We don't know the exact date, but around 1240, the tensions that are mounting between these rival princes finally explode at a feast, where Batu, who's of course the commander, drinks first in front of the other princes. But at this point, Guyuk's had enough of Batu's showmanship, and he starts to berate him. They all join in criticizing and shouting at and threatening Batu. And once that had happened, these armies couldn't really continue to operate together. So Guyuk was, in kind of mysterious circumstances, called back to Mongolia. And so, at the same time, Mungke, the Tuluid Prince Mungke, was called back. So what has happened around 1240 is that a major component, these retinues of these princes, have left the campaign in the west.
After resting over summer 1240, the remaining Mongol forces under Batu directed their strength against the greatest of the Rus cities, Kiev. In a short siege in December 1240, Kiev fell, the Mongols wreaking great ruin upon it. Turning their eyes west, the Principality of Halych-Volhynia, the Polish duchies, and Kingdom of Hungary laid open before them. Kipchak's fleeing Mongol armies had sought shelter in Hungary, and the housing of Mongol enemies was always grounds for war. Batu prepared his troops for the final stage of the campaign. Following the gaze of Batu, our attention turns to the Hungarian kingdom. At that time, Hungary was one of the great powers of Europe. The Magyars, as the Hungarians call themselves, came to Europe as nomadic horse archers, like the Mongols, conquering the Pannonian Basin in the 8th century and raiding Western Europe. At Lechfeld in 955, they were defeated by Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Then, some 50-odd years later, they officially adopted Christianity with the baptism of Stephen I, the first king of Hungary, on Christmas Day in the year 1000. In the following centuries, they gradually abandoned the old ways. With a still formidable military, the Hungarian kingdom emerged as the lead power between the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and the Kievan Rus to the east. controlling not just modern Hungary, but large swathes of present-day Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia and Croatia, the Hungarian monarch ruled a diverse realm. Hungary was the crossroads between Catholic and Orthodox Christendom and the Great Steppes. The influence of the Hungarian king stretched beyond his borders, across the Balkans, Cuman lands and Western Rus principalities. In 1241, the man standing between Europe and the Mongols was Béla IV, king of Hungary.
Béla IV in the Hungarian historiography usually mentioned, usually referred to as the second founder of the country. St. Stephen I, he is the founder of the medieval kingdom of Hungary, and as the second founder, it's quite often mentioned that it was Béla IV. Béla IV was the king of the country in the period of the Mongol invasions. He ruled the country from 1235 until 1270.
Born in 1206, the same year Chinggis Khan declared his empire in distant Mongolia, Béla had a rocky relationship with his father, King Andras. His decentralization of the kingdom, through rich land rewards to the nobility, frustrated Béla. As their tension progressed, Béla essentially made himself an autonomous monarch in Hungary's Croatian territory. With Béla's marriage to a Byzantine princess, King Andras urged the Pope to annul the union and expelled Béla from the kingdom. Ultimately, he allowed his son to return, appointing Béla in the 1220s as ruler of Transylvania. There, Béla came into regular contact with the Cumans, the general term the Europeans used for the Kipchak peoples.
When the Mongols attacked the Cumans, a part of the Cumans fled to the west, among them to the territory of the Hungarian kingdom. And it's very interesting that the Cuman Confederacy was a sphere of interest of the Hungarian kingdom. The Hungarian king Béla IV was at that time in rule, and he even began proselytizing activity. They wanted to make the Cumans Christian. We have reported that some Cuman chiefs were even baptized and became vassals of the Hungarian king.
Cuman presence increased with the eastern upheavals from Mongol expansion, with thousands of Cumans fleeing to Hungary for asylum over the 1220s and 30s. Many were baptized, willingly or as an effort to secure Hungarian aid. Béla was drawn to the Cumans as a pillar of support against his father, while also boosting his reputation as a good Christian ruler by encouraging missionary work among them, styling himself Rex Cumaniae, king of the Cumans. Most Mongol imperial sources discuss Hungary, or as they knew it, Keller, as if it were a target from the outset of the campaign. It is possible that rumor made it down the steps of Béla's coronation as king of the Cumans, and that it was perceived that the Hungarian king had been declared a sort of Great Khan of some united Cuman-Kipchak confederation. For the Mongols, who saw the Cuman-Kipchaks as primary targets of the campaign, this made a hypothetical Kipchak king a major foe. While the reality of Béla's position became more apparent as the army marched west, in distant Mongolia it was hard to correct such a misunderstanding, inadvertently assuring the Hungarian kingdom would hear the hooves of Mongol horsemen. Béla made few friends after his coronation in 1235. The first years of his reign saw the reclamation of crown lands and reduction in privileges of the nobility, while expanding the kingdom. Border territories were taken from Bulgaria, and in 1238, Béla's brother, Kalman, forced their rule in Bosnia. Béla's efforts made him unpopular among the aristocracy of the kingdom, who felt their rights trampled upon. When a large body of Cumans, under their leader, Curten, sought refuge in Hungary in 1239, Béla was only too happy to welcome them. As many as 40,000 skilled mounted archers, loyal directly to Béla, provided him with a massive bodyguard against a possible uprising from the barons of the kingdom, and Béla heaped rewards and rights upon them.
Kütten was a local chief, so he was not the chief of all Cuman, since there was no Cuman Empire, but local confederacies. And one of them, a lot of information can be found in Russian sources about the different Cuman confederacies. Now, Kütten is also mentioned in Russian sources. His name is Kotyan in Russian sources, which became Kütten in Hungarian. We don't know his motivation well. He fled with his folks. Actually, the Hungarian king Béla IV accepted them as a troop of warriors who could help him to wage war with the Mongols.
Contrary to some depictions, Béla did not consume himself with internal infighting while the Mongols approached. Of all accusations that can be leveled against him, he was never a monarch sitting idly on his hands. He was aware of the Mongols' western expansion. One contemporary author, Thomas of Spelato, records that the Hungarians had heard so many rumors of impending Mongol invasions that when news came of their arrival in the 1240s, it was treated as a joke. The king did not treat it as a joke. Béla certainly had up-to-date information from refugees, like the Cuman leader Kütten, and Rus princes like Mikhail Visvolodovich of Chernihiv and his son Rostislav, who fled to his court as the Mongols marched west. The Dominican friar Julian returned with letters from Batu demanding Béla's submission.
Father Julian was a Dominican friar who had a special role during the Western campaign extension of the Mongol Empire. The Dominicans, like the Franciscans, who were founded their order in the beginning of the 12th century, were very active in Christian proselytizing activities, both the Dominicans and the Franciscans.
Frater Julian was the first who heard about the upcoming Mongol invasion because he went to find the old Hungarians and he heard the rumors that the Mongols want to invade Western Europe, and he brought this news to Hungary and to the Pope.
In addition to these informants, Béla was also the recipient of many Mongol envoys. Among them, as recorded by the contemporary chronicler Matthew Paris, was even an Englishman in Mongol service who had gained skill as an interpreter and envoy. King Béla therefore had foreknowledge, and some defensive measures were enacted.
In the previous scholarship, it was believed that Béla IV, the king of Hungary, didn't really believe to Julian, and he wasn't really prepared for the attack. But the recent scholarship proved that it's not the truth, because Béla IV made serious efforts to save the country unsuccessfully.
So when in the early weeks of 1241 the Mongol troops arrived to the northeastern border region of the country, Béla IV collected his royal army in the central region of the country, close to Pest, made the preparation for a military campaign against the Mongols. Of course, this type of preparation took a couple of weeks, so he couldn't respond immediately. First groups of the Mongols arrived, for example, to medieval Pest very early, before the Hungarian Royal Army was able to respond to this attack.
Passes through the Carpathian Mountains, the shields dividing the Hungarian plain from the Eurasian steppe, were blocked with traditional wooden barriers and fallen trees, and fortresses in Transylvania were refortified. The crux of his defense relied on the Cumans. Their horse archery and experience in steppe tactics were a mighty aid to the already formidable Hungarian army, well armored and experienced. A strategy was planned should Mongol armies cross his borders, and the relatively speedy mobilization of troops may suggest other preparations. In fact, Béla was the only monarch in Europe preparing for their arrival. In the very last days of 1240, news must have come to him of the fall of Kiev and the impending approach of the Mongols. War was now inevitable. Following the fall of Kiev on the 6th of December 1240, Batu and Sube'etei moved their army west and began to divide into columns. The total Mongol force by this stage of the campaign is difficult to gauge, with estimates of around 50 to 60,000 troops being common, reinforced by newly subjugated Kipchaks, Mordvins and Rus peoples. Intelligence was carefully collected, strengths assessed. This part of the campaign is sometimes dismissed as a raid or a probing operation, but structurally it differed little from the previous years of campaigning, and the Mongol belief in world hegemony was well established. At the borders of Hungary and Poland at the start of 1241, Batu must have anticipated a conquest of both, and likely expected to push into Germany as well. Batu feared being outflanked by the enemy, and it was deemed necessary to send a portion of the army into Poland, at that time divided into 5 duchies. With Bela IV's daughter married to a lead Polish duke, it was foreseen that Polish aid may come to the Hungarians from the north. Thus, Order and Baidar took perhaps 20,000 troops over the Polish border in February 1241. The main Mongol army, under Batu and Sube'etei, was to conquer Hungary. Alongside Batu and Sube'etei's men, 3 smaller detachments were to penetrate various passes along Hungary's Carpathian frontier, by this means allowing the Mongols to surround Bela's kingdom from multiple points. On March 12th, Batu and Sube'etei crossed the Varetska Pass, the northeastern route the Magyars themselves first took to enter Hungary. The other divisions of the army likely took the following routes. Ugedei's son, Hadan, took his contingent most probably through the Tehuta Pass into northern Transylvania. One of Tolui's sons, Berjek, likely took his force through the Oituz Pass into central Transylvania, and the Noyan Burundai diverted far south, possibly coming up through the Tornuroshu Pass into southern Transylvania, linking up with Berjek at Alba Iulia. Meanwhile, at the beginning of March, King Bela IV gathered his forces at Pest, part of today's Budapest. His requests to foreign rulers for aid were largely ignored. Bela had in mind an orderly countermarch against the Mongol army, but things quickly slipped from his hands. Some of the Hungarian nobles held their forces back, refusing to come in the first place. The Mongols broke through the Carpathians quicker than anticipated. The Palatine of the kingdom, Deni, fought with Batu's forces on the 12th of March and was forced to flee with a few men. He and his bedraggled riders came to Bela at Pest to confirm the Mongols' crossing of the mountains. News came in of nobles attacking them without support. Defeated piecemeal, they fell back to Pest with their tails between their legs. Archbishop Ugrin of Koloksha defied Bela's order and likewise marched ahead to engage the Mongols. He just barely escaped with his life. The Duke of Austria, the quarrelsome Friedrich II, came to Bela's call for aid, defeated a small Mongol party in a skirmish near Pest, and withdrew, acting as if he had crushed the entire Mongol host. The Bishop of Varad fought the Mongols near Eger, where he was defeated and the city destroyed. Reports began flooding into Bela of his kingdom's nobility allowing themselves to be defeated one by the Mongols, while yet more Mongol forces kept showing up from new directions, and rumors swirled of destruction in Poland. By March 17th, the city of Vach, only 40 kilometers from Pest, had fallen to the Mongols. Every day, small scouting parties were appearing in the environs of Pest, trying to entice the Hungarians into pursuit. From Bela's point of view, it must have seemed that the Mongols were everywhere, thousands upon thousands rampaging over his kingdom. The Mongols often employed this strategy, aiming to demoralize and hamper any united response, preventing their foe from bringing his weight to bear in one location. It made their numbers appear greater than they were, and raised doubts as to where they would strike next. In this air of uncertainty, Batu expected the Hungarians to be unable to gather their might against them. On top of that, the tensions between Cumans and Hungarians had not abated. The kingdom's nobility were angry at the privileges Bela had granted the nomads, while the herding of the Cumans' animals through farms and fields of the kingdom's agricultural population furthered resentment. News of Cumans among the Mongol forces led to cries that Bela's Cuman allies were spies for Batu. Bela placed the Cuman leader Köten and his family under guard in Pest in order to protect them, but in an assault led by Hungarian nobles and agents of the Austrian Duke, Köten, his family and his retinue were killed. In turn, this prompted a pogrom by Hungarians in the area against the Cumans.
It was the conflict of two worldviews, two societies. The Hungarians and the Germans who lived in Buda were settled people. Because of a conflict, killed the chief of the Cumans, Köten, and then his whole army and folk left Hungary in the southern direction to what is now Serbia and the Balkans.
The discontent, stoked by the tense situation and the barons, turned into outright fighting between the Cumans and the Hungarians. The remaining Cumans refused to risk their lives for such allies and abandoned the Hungarians. They left a trail of destruction as they flew en masse to Bulgaria, some making their way to the Latin Empire of Constantinople. One of the core parts of Bela's defensive plans had just evaporated, as the Mongols came ever closer, forcing him into action. At the start of April 1241, a Mongol army approached Pest, and Bela finally marched out to face it. The Mongols fled before the Magyar host, and for a week Bela pursued them, reaching the village of Mohi on the Shayo River. He found a larger Mongol army arranged on the opposite bank, a single bridge across, the only passage. It was the 10th of April. Only the day before, the armies of Order and Baidar had crushed the Poles at Legnica. Now, the Battle of Mohi was about to begin. For a week, King Bela had pursued Shiban, Batu's younger brother, onto ground of Batu's choosing. But to better understand that ground and why it was chosen, kings and generals sent a team to Hungary to have a look at that very ground.
So this is the monument to the Battle of Mohi then?
Yes, this is a memorial site which has been constructed here. Actually, we are very close to medieval Mohi, or it was called Mohi at that time. We are also close to modern Mohi, which is a small village. It had a different name before. It was called Poga, and in the early 20th century it was renamed in order to commemorate this place. And then a few decades ago, this memorial site has been created here to commemorate the Battle of Mohi, which is of course a very important historical turning point in Hungarian history.
Mm-hmm. So, but this is not built on the actual site of the battle?
No, because that is, in fact, would be very difficult to say what is the actual site of the battle. We may say that something surely happened here. This is in the area, in the larger area, where we can identify various elements of the battle itself.
So Joschka, if this isn't the battle site, where is it and how do we know it's not here?
Okay, so the strange situation is with the battlefield that in one way we know a lot about it because we have got quite detailed textual sources. We have got descriptions by Hungarians or people living in contemporary Hungary. They were not eyewitnesses, they were not present in the battle, but we know that they talked to people who were present in the battle, including the king. And we also have got Chinese texts which recorded in some ways the Mongol side of the story. And these texts are quite detailed in the sense that we know that one of the most important part of the story happened at a bridge on the Shayo River. We also know that there was a campsite of the king, Bela IV, and there was a battle part there as well. But when we try to pin down these elements of the story, of the narratives, what we have got, we are facing difficulties. Because the exact location of some of these things is very problematic. We can start with the Sajo River. Sajo River is moving, it's continuously moving, it's meandering. Therefore, the present-day riverbed of the Sajo doesn't say anything about the riverbed in 1241. So therefore, the site of the bridge is also very problematic.
Despite not knowing exactly where the battlefield at Mohi was in April 1241, a reasonable guess of what conditions on the river looked like that day can be made through studies of the landscape and its historical geography.
So we're sitting at the Sajo River now, and is this the kind of site that would have faced the Mongol armies that night in April 1241?
Yes, actually, it's interesting. We are now in summertime, which is usually low level for the river, because what we know from historical sources, from actual measurements for the last 100 years, that usually Sajo is flooding in April. And of course, we know that the battle took place in early April. The river is pretty fast, it's moving fast, and this means, although it's not a big river, it's not that simple that you just cross the river if you are not crossing it on the bridge, about which we know from the descriptions, because we know that at least 2 other places were used to cross the river. Building any kind of pontoon bridge is a difficult thing, and crossing a river like this on horseback is also a challenge. It's not so much because it's such a big river, but it's because it's fast, and also the other side can be quite problematic. Here, where we're sitting now, is very simple. You know, you can just get out from the river. But in some other places, you have got 2-3 meter high river banks. So to climb on that one, coming on horseback, that's really very difficult. And if you imagine that there may well be some soldiers standing on the other side who can shoot you, then it's even a very dangerous, even more dangerous situation. So if the Sajo is flooding like this, very often it creates new meanders, it cuts through, and it creates a new riverbed for itself. So therefore, the present day situation with the Sajo River is not helpful for us to figure out where these crossings
It's
were.
not the same course of the river as it was 800 years ago.
Absolutely not.
For King Bela, approaching from the west, he would have seen only a narrow bridge passing between the trees over the wide, muddy river as Mongol riders darted over it. While efforts have been made to locate the remains of the bridge over the Sajo River, it has proven difficult. The changing riverbed over the course of centuries has made the search difficult. Only the foundations of more recent structures have been found. Without knowing where the 13th century bridge lay, archaeologists struggle to identify the precise site of the battle in 1241, or even the scale of the bridge. Likely, it was a wooden structure, wide enough for a cart to pass over, but one which would be a death trap for any large force attempting to cross over. With only one route over the river and thick trees hiding the opposing army from view, King Bela must have immediately identified it as a trap if ever there was one. Had Bela sent his army over the bridge, then they certainly would have been surrounded and caught between the Mongols and the river. Instead, the Hungarian king retained tight control over his men. Using an age-old defensive tactic, they secured their camp with a wagon fort, gaps between the wagons protected by shields. As King Bela's army approached the village of Mohi and the Sajo River, Mongol messengers informed Batu of the size of the approaching Hungarian force. Batu was unnerved by what he learned. In both European and Persian accounts of the battle, the Hungarian force was double the size of the Mongols. Bela's army must have consisted largely of cavalry. In the accounts the Mongols spread of the battle, they always refer to the horsemen of Kela as their foes there. The core of Bela's army would have been his knights, heavy cavalry, equipped in rather typical mid-13th century European gear. That is, the most well-off were covered in mail, their heads protected by great helms. Their horses, too, were protected by thick quilted or even mail armor. The lance was their primary weapon, with sword, axe and mace as sidearms. A number of the Hungarians, particularly the poorer, still fought in the manner of their ancestors, as lightly armored horse archers. An important component of the army was the Knights Templar, largely from France. The rest were feudal troops raised by Bela and his barons from across his kingdom, of Hungarian, German and Slavic origins. The Hungarians were experienced, courageous warriors who had fought numerous campaigns and even recently been on crusade. While not having grown up in the saddle like the nomads, the Hungarians were certainly no strangers to it, and it was no small task to face them in the field. The Mongol army was of varied background. The backbone of the army was lightly armored horse archers, characteristic of Mongol and Turkic nomads of the steppe. The average trooper was protected by thickly padded coats, or no armor at all, and would only close with the enemy if absolutely necessary. Representatives of other conquered and vassal peoples were also present, such as recently enrolled contingents of Kipchaks and Mordvins, as well as the recently subjugated people of the Rus principalities, or eastern parts of the Hungarian kingdom, who were driven before the army as labourers and fighters. The Mongols had their own heavy cavalry, though it made up a smaller portion of their force compared to Bela's host. Various sources note that anywhere from 10 to 30% of the Mongol army were armoured. The heavy armoured Mongol cavalryman was typically equipped in lamina, leather bands that wrapped around the body, or lamella, small metal plates laced together. These armours did not cover the person as fully as the European equipment, leaving hands and faces exposed, so as to not impede the use of the bow, which was still the main weapon even of the Mongol heavy horse. Their spears were armed with hooks, designed to pull horsemen from the saddle.
These look like mace heads. Where were they found?
Ezeket a buzogányokat számtalan egyéb töredékes buzogánnyal, kard, alkatrészekkel a településnek a keleti oldalán találtuk, lényegében a szélén a településnek, ahol fölvehették a magyar erők a állásokat, és ott próbálták meg megállítani a keletről nyomuló mongol egységeket, és ennek lehet a nyoma rengeteg fegyver alkatrész a település területén.
As for the weapons and the style of them, what does it say about the warriors who possessed these maces? Do the shape of them, does it indicate who they were?
Mindenképpen, hiszen régóta tudjuk, hogy a 13. század folyamán számtalan ilyen fegyverleletünk van az Alföld és Magyarország területéről, és a környezetéből is, és ezek főként bronz buzogányok, de vannak vas buzogányok is közöttük. Ezeket a kunokhoz kötötték, egy biztos, hogy keleti típusú fegyverzetről van szó, és ezek között is azért vannak valóban különböző típusok. A legérdekesebb az éppen a kolostor területéről előkerült buzogány, amely mindegyiktől különbözik. Ez gyaníthatóan szintén keleti és szeldzsük területekre vezet leginkább az analógia, ami azt jelenti, hogy ez is nyilván az ostromlóknak volt a fegyverzete.
The advance of the large Hungarian force gave Batu pause. It was never ideal to face battle against a more heavily armoured and larger enemy force. Having observed the formation of the Hungarian camp, Batu felt himself renewed with confidence. If the Hungarians were unwilling to cross the river, then he would bring the battle to them. Mongol leaders Batu and Sube'etei had hoped the Hungarian king Bela would try to cross the bridge over the Sayo River. But by digging in at Mohi, Bela forced the Mongols to act. As the Hungarian army settled into their camp at Mohi, Batu viewed them from a nearby burial mound, an ancient nomad kurgan.
So you've brought us now to the physically highest point we've been so far yet in the Great Hungarian Plain. Are we standing right now in the same spot Batu Khan himself might have stood in April 1241?
Yeah, it's possible. The place is called Stráža Halom, which is a modern name. It means a place from where you can guard, a place from where you can see very far. Interestingly, we have got two sources. They are both telling that Batu climbed a hill, went to the top of a mount, which may well be not one single story. One is recorded in Juvani, which is the Mongol side of the story.
Persian writer in the 1250s.
Yes, which means that he went to a pretty high hill for a kind of spiritual meeting with the supernatural, which we know is going back to Genghis time. So before a battle, you pray, meditate, you gather strength for the actual battle. But we know from a Hungarian source that Batu, maybe some other military leaders of the Mongol army, came to a higher point, which is not necessarily a big hill from where you can see everything. You can see the camp of the Hungarian king. And in fact, although it's quite far from here, a few kilometers from here, you can see it, particularly in a clear April night. The fires of the soldiers, how big it was, what was the position, so crucial information for a battle, which then probably led to this surprise plan, what they have worked out, which was successful for the Mongol army.
In the secret history of the Mongols, we have a similar description of a ritual, and actually I use this text uttered by Genghis Khan that time, and the way, the non-verbal communication with the highest power, with the Tengri, and what is described by Juvayni. That Batu ascended to that hill and stayed there for a long time and prayed. He asked the help of the eternal heaven and, I would say, even the Lord spirits of that particular place, even if it's foreign, even if it's not his homeland, but asked to support his endeavor and support him.
Seeing how the Hungarians had packed themselves tightly within a lager, a wagon fort, Batu likened them to sheep trapping themselves within a pen. Still, it foiled Batu's plan. Frustrated, Batu had to force a crossing, neutralizing his army's mobility and playing to the strengths of the Hungarians' heavier armor. But Sube'etei had a plan. While Batu took his men over the bridge under the cover of night, Sube'etei was to take a force downstream and build a pontoon bridge to cross over the Sayo and outflank the Hungarians. If all went well, they would strike the Hungarians on two fronts and thus outmaneuver them. But Sube'etei's plan did not work. The waters downstream were deep, and in the darkness, progress on his pontoon bridge was slow. It could not be completed. Either in his impatience or belief Sube'etei was on schedule, Batu ordered the assault over the bridge. Unfortunately for him, the Hungarians were prepared. According to the chronicler Thomas of Spoleto, a Rus prisoner had escaped the Mongol camp and warned the Hungarians of the Mongol advance. Once a part of Batu's force had crossed the bridge around midnight, Bela's brother, Prince Kalman, the Bishop of Ugrin, and the master of the Knights Templar in Hungary, led the counterattack. According to Sube'etei's biography, Batu had sent over an elite unit of Batar, heavily armored heroes. but this valuable unit, surprised and likely out of formation after the bridge crossing, could not stop the charge of the Hungarian heavy cavalry. The Mongols were driven back to the bridge, and it seems in the confined space the Batar were subject to slaughter at the hands of Kalman and his knights. 30 members of this elite unit, as well as its commander, one of Batu's senior officers, fell to the Hungarians. Kalman himself personally threw the Mongol commander off the bridge in at least one source. The Mongols were forced to abandon the crossing, and the Hungarians returned to their camp jubilant, leaving a small guard over the bridge to prevent another unimpeded Mongol crossing. Both European and Chinese sources written from Mongol documents indicate Mongol losses were heavy. The Yuan Shi indicates the princes among Batu's forces were greatly perturbed by the losses and desired to withdraw and replan. One Franciscan friar, C. de Bridia, wrote that the Mongol vanguard had broke on the bridge and fled. Another Franciscan, who had travelled through the Mongol Empire in the years after the invasion, John de Plano Carpini, reported that Batu had to deliver a heroic speech to stop the Mongol princes from trying to flee. "Do not flee, for if you do, not one will escape, and if we are to die, let us all die, for that is about to happen which Chinggis Khan foretold when he said we should be put to death. If the time has now come, let us endure." For Batu, there was an obvious explanation as to what had gone wrong. He believed it was Subaday's failure to cross the river which had foiled the plan, and Batu unleashed his rage on the old commander. The stalwart Subaday was not to be swayed, despite the prince's wrath. In response to voices urging retreat, Subaday's Yuan Shi biography reports that he exclaimed to the doubting princes, "If my lord wishes to retreat, then retreat by yourself. Until I reach the Magyar city on the Danube River, I will never return." Perhaps both men delivered speeches to quell the doubts of the generals, according to the historical records. But descriptions of Mongol unease following the bridge disaster abound in a variety of sources, often from the Mongols' own point of view, and match each other even when written on opposite sides of Eurasia. The struggle for the bridge had been severe, but not decisive. The Mongols needed a new plan to force the river. The Hungarians left a light guard on the bridge, while their distant camp slept soundly. Only a few hours after the initial clash, in the early hours of April 11th, before dawn, the Hungarian bridge guard was rocked by the sudden crashing of stones descending on them from the darkness. The Mongols had set up 7 of their Chinese catapults and were shelling the enemy position. The shock demoralized the guard, and when the Mongols charged over the bridge, they broke through the ravaged defenders. Survivors ran back to the camp, shouting alarm. But the Hungarians were slow to rise, not having anticipated an attack so soon. Subaday's forces crossed his pontoon bridge, and the Mongols swarmed around the Hungarian camp. Though Bela's decision to circle the camp with a wall of wagons offered some protection, the space was too small for his large army. Panic set in, as thousands of men woke to cries of anguish and Mongol arrows raining among them, as the Mongols tried to set the wagons on fire. In the densely packed camp, men tripped over tents and tent ropes, crushing each other in the fray. Confusion reigned, and Bela's fortifications trapped his men. Prince Kalman, the Bishop of Ugrin, and the Templars had been the only ones expecting an assault. They charged out of the camp in a tight formation to force back the Mongols. The knights inflicted casualties on their enemy before returning to the camp in good order. They had hoped the effort would have given the Hungarians time to rally on the other fronts, but they were disappointed at what they found. Archbishop Ugrin furiously chastised the Hungarian troops. His fury moved a few to arms, and they joined the bishop, Kalman, and the Templars on the next sally forth. Here their courage earned them only doom, for the Mongols expected their counterattack. Without the element of surprise, the exhausted knights and their horses were picked off by the Mongols. Kalman and Ugrin were seriously wounded, while the Templars, despite brave efforts, were killed to a man. The remnants of the bedraggled Hungarian cavalry returned to camp a final time, having failed to drive off the Mongols. By 6 in the morning, the Hungarian camp was surrounded, except for one route. The Mongols had left a gap, and many of the shocked Hungarians, including it seems King Bela, ran to take it. This was a trap. Men surrounded with nowhere to run will fight to the death, but provide an avenue for survival and they'll take it. In the disorganized rout of the Hungarians, no formation or protection was to be had. As if herding their sheep, the Mongols followed along both sides of the ragged line of refugees, ensuring none veered off trail. Once the prey was exhausted, Batu's wolves fell upon them. Survivors were led directly into a marsh where many drowned, encumbered in their armor and weak from injuries and exhaustion. The Bishop Ugrin met his end in these waters, only one amongst many of the nobles, bishops and archbishops of the kingdom who fell. Bela and his brother Kalman barely escaped, with Kalman grievously injured. So ended the Battle of Mohi. The back of organized Hungarian resistance was broken. The fate of at least one party of survivors at Mohi was revealed in grisly detail archaeologically.
So what are we doing here today, Joska? Where have you brought us?
Okay, so this is a site called Helyük-keresztül vizek köze, which is an important archaeological site, although it doesn't look like, because today it's a parking lot of the M30 motorway. The most interesting thing was that we found, or the archaeologist, namely Maria Wolf, who was the leader of the excavation, found traces of contemporary buildings, so houses from the 13th century, very simple buildings. They are kind of sunken huts. But what was totally unusual, that they had lots of objects, very precious objects, I mean expensive objects, and most of them were iron objects and weapons. So we have got a whole sword, quite an expensive one. We also have got a metal plate, a part of a metal plate, which was in fact the metal plate coming from an expensive armor. Oh. And that is very unusual in a house of a peasant. It would not be there in normal conditions. And these people tried to escape from the battle after it became clear that it was a lost battle. So they tried to save their life and got into this settlement. Probably they tried to hide themselves in these houses.
So what we're looking at is one of the many small clashes in the hours, in the days, in the week after the Battle of Mohi, and we happen to find this one, and who knows how many like it also occur all across this region.
Yeah, I think so, that's the point. So all around in this area, there were probably dozens similar small islands in the marshy landscape. And people who were running away from the battlefield, they of course tried to find a hiding place, maybe in the marsh, maybe in the reed, maybe in a settlement. Yes, I believe there are dozens of similar sites here. Whether we will be able to find them, that's a different question.
King Bela IV had escaped the disaster at Mohi, as had his brother Prince Kalman, and some unknown numbers of other soldiers and nobles. While most fled west and south, Bela took a different route to the north. It was an unexpected choice the Mongols did not anticipate. It proved to be a good decision, allowing him to escape unharmed.
When Bela IV retreated from the Battle of Mohi, the Mongols were waiting to get him. Like, he was #1 target. And so he left the Hungarian camp and was being pursued. And he made it into the mountains, because the mountains of Slovakia are not actually very far away from this battlefield. This is one lucky thing for the Hungarians, at least those who were on horseback. and he was able to get into the forest and survive. But years later, when he was writing to a charter to a nobleman who had helped him at the battle, he said, "I was so close to death that I could see death just before my eyes, and it seemed there was nothing left to do but die."
Nonetheless, the Battle of Mohi was a disaster for the Hungarians. Alongside the sheer volume in manpower lost, many of the kingdom's highest-ranking figures had been killed. From top bishops, archbishops, effectively all the Knights Templar within the kingdom, to Bela's chancellor, and untold knights and other members of the nobility, all were among the fallen. In one stroke, the head of the Hungarian administrative apparatus was nearly severed. Though Bela and his grievously injured brother Kalman survived, they were on the run, desperate to get as far from the Mongols as possible. In the even terrain of the Great Hungarian Plain, east of the Danube River, it was hard to get far enough. Prince Kalman reached Pest, where the Hungarian army had ridden from so confidently only a week prior. He urged the inhabitants to flee, but was rebuffed, the wall-less town choosing only then to begin building ditches and defences. Kalman rode on to Zagreb in Croatia, where the valiant warrior succumbed to his injuries that May. Bela rode to his territories west of the Danube River, near the Austrian border, where his wife and young children were. There they were invited to seek refuge in Austria by its Duke, Friedrich the Quarrelsome of House Babenberg.
And a funny thing about Bela IV and his relationship with Duke Friedrich II of Austria was it was a very turbulent relationship. And yet, because the Mongols presented an adversary to both of them, they sort of saw each other as potential help. So even though Bela was a rival and enemy of Friedrich of Austria, he fled to Austria for safety.
Bela headed to the Austrian fortress of Hainburg, where he was promptly imprisoned. The Duke demanded an exorbitant ransom from the Hungarian king. The Austrian Gasten Annals acknowledged that Duke Friedrich may have even gathered an army for the purpose, just to intimidate King Bela. Bela reluctantly paid, then rejoined his family in Hungary before fleeing south to Croatia. Duke Friedrich also began extorting money from refugees displaced by the Mongols and seeking shelter in Austria. Bela reached Zagreb around the 18th of May 1241, in time to bury his dear brother Kalman. In some accounts, he was forced to give him an unmarked grave to avoid it being desecrated by the Mongols. In his absence, Hungary was left to the armies of the Great Khan. But even while on this flight, King Bela tried to organize aid for his people. Whilst in Zagreb, in summer 1241, Bela corresponded with Pope Gregory IX for help from the west. Unfortunately, Pope Gregory essentially shrugged off Bela's pleas, informing him no help would come as long as the Holy See and the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich II Hohenstaufen were locked in conflict. Bela even offered to become a vassal to the Emperor Friedrich in exchange for help against the Mongol threat, an offer which went nowhere. Friedrich himself, in his letters to other European monarchs, showed that he was following events in the east closely. As reported by the monk Alberic of Trois-Fontaines in 1238, Friedrich had even received a demand for submission from the Mongols. In return, they would offer him his choice of lands in Europe and great office in the Mongol Empire. To this, Kaiser Friedrich reportedly replied that he was fit only to be a falconer. At the time of the Mongol invasion, the Holy Roman Emperor was in Italy. He sent letters to King Henry III of England and Louis IX of France, suggesting they should unite against the Mongol incursion, though this letter, as recorded by the chronicler Matthew Paris, showed Friedrich still far too concerned with his primary internal foe, the Pope. Still, Friedrich's son, Conrad, King of Germany, began to collect a crusading force to repel the Mongols. But this came to naught. Conrad's army only advanced some 80 kilometers east of Nuremberg in July 1241 before dispersing. By September, the German nobility was rebelling against Conrad, and civil war was breaking out. while the Saintonge War between France and England began in early 1242. While Pope Gregory had ordered the preaching of crusade against the Mongols, he died in August 1241. His successor survived only 3 weeks, leaving the position vacant until Innocent IV's election in 1243. Bela would see no aid from the West. No small amount of tragedy continued to plague him. Thousands of his kingdom's refugees fled across the region, while personally, 2 of his young daughters passed away during the flight. There was little time to mourn, as they were forced to continually run as a Mongol army under Hadan pursued them. After a flight down the Dalmatian coastline and barely evading his pursuers, Bela took refuge on an island just offshore, before finally going to sea, narrowly avoiding Hadan's riders. At one point, he sailed close to the shore to view Hadan's army, who could only watch in frustration.
This may have seemed like a failure, because if we look at the Khwarezmian Empire's collapse a decade or 2 earlier with Chinggis Khan when he attacked the Khwarezmian Empire, the Shah likewise fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, but he died there, and the empire collapsed and was a spectacular, quick victory. But in this case, Bela IV has survived. The Mongols know that he can actually just disappear into the ocean. In fact, they may have actually thought Bela IV had totally left the region. And so from their point of view, they had not destroyed their primary target.
The Mongols considered the Battle of Mohi over the 10th and 11th of April 1241 among their greatest victories. A hard-fought battle over a determined enemy. Though the battle over the bridge was close, Mongol losses ran high, and certain princes wished to retreat. In the end, Batu and Sube'etei outplayed the Hungarians and destroyed the royal army. United defense against the Mongols in Hungary was over. It would be up to individual settlements to protect themselves. Even on the day of the victory at Mohi, the other Mongol armies in Hungary were overrunning cities in the southeast of the kingdom. In the following weeks, the army of Order and Baidar was making its way from Poland through Bohemia into the northwestern frontier of Hungary. The Hungarian kingdom was about to be overrun. As Batu and Sube'etei began the march westwards, they allowed their men to split up to maximize their plundering. Unfortified settlements across the Great Hungarian Plain, easy and accessible lands for horsemen, were now prey to the Mongols.
Some parts of the country, Great Plain and other regions, were under Mongol occupation almost for a year. So of course at those territories the devastation was much more significant. And also there were significant territories of the country which were not attacked by the Mongols. For example, the mountainous peripheral regions, for example in present-day Slovakia, that time in northern Hungary. There are quite significant differences of the impact, which is reflected partly by the population loss. Of course, we do not have precise data.
An emotional eyewitness account of the horrors of the 1241 occupation is recorded for us by the Archbishop of Virad, an Italian-born Dominican named Master Roger, sometimes called Rogerius. Written shortly after the invasion, Roger describes his own harrowing journey on the run from the Mongols, including first-hand information from other survivors.
Well, there are not plenty of sources during the Arpadian period, but almost half of them is from these 2 years. It's about the Mongol invasion. There are plenty of Hungarian sources, charters. The most famous one is the account of a certain cleric called Rogerius, and he was captured by the Mongols, and he gave a detailed description about the Mongols, the reason why Hungary fallen because of the Mongol invasion. He also described the events of the Mongol invasion. This is a very, very important source.
Roger had fled Varet, modern Oradea in Romania, shortly before the city was destroyed by Hadan's troops. Watching from the forest, he saw Hadan leave only Varad's castle standing before withdrawing. After several days, the castle's defenders came down from the walls to rebuild the town, thinking their deep moat and wooden towers had scared off the Mongols. At dawn a few days later, Hadan's riders reappeared. They killed those outside the walls who had been repairing them, then surrounded the castle, setting up 7 catapults which bombarded the walls ceaselessly day and night. The towers and newly fortified sections of the walls were all demolished in quick succession. The defenders were killed, and the women and survivors who fled into the church were trapped when the Mongols set it aflame. Withdrawing again, the Mongols waited several days before returning once more to kill those survivors who had come out of hiding for food. Roger saw this carried out several times. A German village on the Tris River, which he nearly stayed in, was obliterated shortly after his departure. Sanad, where he hoped to flee, was destroyed before he could arrive. For a while, he found refuge at a fortified island, accessible only by a narrow passage and gates. After his servants abandoned him, stealing his money and clothes, Roger left the island for the nearby forest, from where he watched Mongol forces arrive. Setting up on one side of the river, the Mongols tricked the defenders into mobilizing there, the defenders anticipating that the Mongols would try a river crossing via that side. While the defenders were thus occupied, another group of Mongols struck the now undefended gates on the opposite side, attacking the defenders from the rear and taking the island. Horrific slaughter ensued, and once again, after a few days, the Mongols returned to kill those survivors who, through hunger, were forced to come out to search for food. These sights met Roger wherever he went. The image he and other sources give is one of unchecked brutality, of people helpless against the invaders, who turned over rock and stone for the treasures underneath. Archaeologically, much of the devastation is corroborated.
The most numerous finds were coin hoards, which were found all around. The biggest number of them in the Great Plain, in the eastern part of Hungary, but some also in the western part or in the northern part. These hoards contained silver coins, many of them actually foreign coins, and jewelry, usually very simple objects of a family, earrings, bracelets, rings, and so on. We call it a horizon in archaeology of hoards, which is connected to 1241-42. And that means, of course, it is Mongol invasion. So people heard the news, they heard about the terrible news, and they tried to hide the valuable things. They wanted to go back for it, but probably they died.
It was not enough to merely hear of these remains. We had to see them for ourselves. At Gödöllő, outside of Budapest, we were granted an opportunity to examine and film more of the artifacts connected to the invasion.
So Tibor, what do we have here?
These are good quality silver coins which were minted in Austria and were used by the beginning of the 13th century in Hungary.
So these coins were buried by local people in Hungary when the Mongols invaded?
Exactly. These were the easily movable assets, jewelry and coins. They were buried in the ground, and the sad reason we can find them is that because these people perished during the conflict.
What about this pot here? What's the story here?
These hoards can be connected to a cave which looked upon a very steep slope, and 4 different hidings were placed around the opening of the cave. And around the cave and inside the cave we have found pottery, which meant that people lived here for a short period. But these pottery shards can be dated exactly to the 13th century, so they were used by the middle of the 13th century.
What are these very sharp-looking objects?
We have found also arrowheads, which suggest that this archaeological site was also a place of conflict. So these arrowheads were actually shot out, and
So we might be witnessing the final stand of these people who were hiding and living in the cave?
yes, so it can be connected to a conflict which ended their lives, in fact.
And that would explain why they didn't dig up their treasure, why it's still sitting here.
To avoid sharing their fate, those who found the most initial success hiding from the Mongols did so by seeking shelter in forests. Master Roger was among those who braved starvation to find protection beyond the trees, which the Mongols preferred not to ride into. Knowing many people hid in the forests, the Mongols sent local captives beyond the tree line with messages that anyone who gave themselves up before a set deadline would be spared, the Mongols allowing them to return to their homes. Having taken the kingdom's royal seal from the corpse of Bela's chancellor at Mohi, the Mongols dispersed forged documents in the name of the king, sending this message to discourage flight. Do not fear the ferocity and madness of the hounds, and do not dare to leave your houses, because although on account of some unforeseen circumstances we had to leave behind the camp and our tents, yet by the favour of God we intend gradually to recover them and fight a valiant battle against the Tartars. Therefore, do nothing except pray that merciful God may permit us to crush the head of our enemies. Starving and scared, many complied and returned to their villages, Master Roger among those leaving the relative safety of the forests. The Mongols appointed Bashars to govern these freshly conquered regions. Mongols, subject peoples, and Hungarians who had sided with the new regime. Roger describes attaching himself to the entourage of a man who had already become a Tatar in deeds. In this way, the well-educated churchman accompanied his new master to weekly meetings of the Mongol-aligned overseers, who installed, over summer 1241, a regional administration. Courts and local governments were established to maintain a sort of justice, one which involved the overseers collecting numerous beautiful women for their own purposes. The villagers were to resume life and bring in the harvest. Once collected, the Mongols rode out, took what they needed for their own men and horses, and burned the rest. With a cold winter and continued depredations in spring 1242 preventing planting, a horrific famine followed that only worsened the suffering of the population.
So that is a new dimension of the research. It does support, in general, the very huge scale destruction, but at the same time, it offers a more nuanced picture, because these dots are creating like a mosaic. We may say the scale of destruction in the Great Plain in the eastern part of the country is really enormous. At the same time, there are significant areas, regions of the kingdom, which seems to be untouched or limited destruction. Western part, southwestern part of the country, where we have got, even today, dozens and dozens of standing Romanesque churches, which means they were not destroyed, or if they were built after the Mongol invasion, there was a local population which was able to build new churches.
There are different hypotheses about the demographical consequences of the Mongol invasions, but it is more or less accepted that overall impact was quite different concerning which region we are speaking about.
While attached to the Mongol administration, Roger was to witness new horrors. He saw firsthand their march on the large village of Pereg, where people of some 70 villages had gathered and made hasty fortifications. Operations began with the Mongols first devastating the region around Pereg, driving more refugees into the village, and denying avenues of escape. In this way, panic rose within the walls of Pereg. Then, with the village surrounded, the Mongols sent forward their prisoners, herded forward by Mongol horsemen. The first line was made up of Hungarian prisoners, then those from the Rus, Muslims and Cumans, whom defenders were forced to kill and waste their ammunition upon. Roger records how the Mongols laughed, killing those who tried to flee, or driving them back into the battle. After a week of fighting, the moat around the village was filled with the bodies of the prisoners. The defenders' ammunition, energy, and will was expended, and the Mongols comfortably rode in and seized the village. It was sacked and destroyed, its population massacred. The nearby Cistercian monastery of Igrish was next to face the Mongols. There, many soldiers had sought refuge, and the Mongols had avoided attacking it directly, fleeing when the garrison sought it out. The Mongols' flights had led the garrison to believe the invaders feared them, only for them to soon find Igrish surrounded by the Mongol army once Perig had fallen. As Roger wrote, the Mongols preferred to take such fortified sites only after devastating the surrounding area, thus trapping the defenders within. Their siege engines then took down the walls of Igrish, and the people within suffered the same fate as all others. Roger offers the following lament once he finished his description of the fall of these villages and the monastery. What else? Were we to describe every battle and all the boundless cruelty that transpired, what transpired would make the reader's hearts tremble and their ears ring from the frightful words. Should such horrible news spread over the world, the princes of this world would think differently. Behold, that summer they destroyed everything, all the way to the borders of Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Poland, Silesia and Campania, as far as the Danube. While we have written accounts of the fall of many cities and sites to the Mongols, many stories went unrecorded, and we only learn about them archaeologically. Across central Hungary, the remains of numerous fortified churches have been discovered, dating to the time of the Mongol invasion. With ditches hastily dug around a central church, these were the only local defences and last stands of many of the kingdom's inhabitants, as they tried to resist Mongol raiding parties.
1241, spring, we don't know exactly when, people who were living in a village, what is called today Sonk, or in the area, and in the neighboring settlements, started to hear terrible news. They heard about the Mongol army, they heard about destruction, desertion, people running away from the eastern part of the country. And when they heard about it, they started to prepare themselves in a hurry. They wanted to fortify their village church, like many other villages did around this time. What they wanted to do, they wanted to make a smaller earthwork fortification using the highest point of the area where the church was originally built, and the churchyard cemetery was situated around it. So they started to dig a ditch, actually not one single, but a double ditch around the church. And the earth, what they had dug out from the ditch, they raised it around the church, and with this they created a small earthwork fortification. And they hoped that they can defend it by themselves, by other people who came from other villages. But the attacking Mongol army was much stronger, bigger, more powerful. So they managed to siege this small fortification. The archaeological excavations revealed dead bodies fallen into the ditch, into the bottom of the field, of the ditch. And obviously, the whole site has been conquered. And we don't know what happened with these people. Many of them were clearly killed. Many of them were left unburied. And probably many of them were taken as war prisoners or hostages, or they were the ones who were forced to attack the next village, similar fortification.
Roger makes this interesting statement in his writings after describing the Battle of Mohi. First, they set aside Hungary beyond the Danube, and assigned their share to all of the chief kings of the Tatars who had not yet arrived in Hungary. They sent word to them on the news, and to hurry, as there was no longer any obstacle before them. Evidently, the Mongols anticipated not just raiding Hungary, but allocating its territory and people to the princes and the Great Khan, as they had elsewhere. Over 1241 at least, the Mongols were still expecting to stay in the region and continue to expand.
After the victory at Muhi, the Mongol princes, we read, met together to divide up appanages, lands given to the princes. According to Master Roger, who was a prisoner of the Mongols and who wrote a memoir about it, they had set up a local administration in Hungary. They had basically created a tax base and resettled peasants who had fled so that they were now farming again and paying taxes.
In 1241 to 1242, this monastery was turned into a base camp. It was surrounded by a ditch dug through the very graves of the inhabitants, and later filled with the carcasses of wild game and animals eaten by the Mongols, and even the bodies of the local population forced into Mongol service. The monastery was looted and destroyed by the end of the occupation, leaving only tantalizing hints at the former wealth of the establishment from the few items left behind by the Mongols.
So, Bernard, do you want to tell me, what is this object that you have here?
This is a figurine from a Limoges cross, and this would have been on the basically on the surface of the cross around a central crucifixion. This would have been one of the figures on the side of this crucifixion. This is an enamel from Limoges, which is in France, and this was a major production center in the at the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century. And we have many different types of these at Péter Monastora. For example, this one, the one that I just showed you, was a quite elaborate one, was probably an expensive one.
So this site seems to have been destroyed by the Mongols in 1241. How come they didn't take objects like this that look quite valuable to me?
I mean, actually they are not that valuable because they were mostly copper with some enamel on them, or this one is gilded. So for them it was not valuable objects. These were most likely destroyed during the sacking of this site or of other villages.
Within a few weeks of the victory at Mohi, Mongol armies converged at Pest, one of the chief cities of the Hungarian kingdom. Batu and Subaday's armies reunited with the forces of Hadan, Burundai and Berjek, the commanders who had campaigned through Transylvania and the south of the kingdom. The hastily constructed defences of Pest were easily penetrated. The town was burned down by the 30th of April 1241. From Pest, the Mongols ravaged the cities on the east and north banks of the Danube River. But they could not cross the wide river itself, especially as the few crossing points and ferries were stoutly defended with newly entrenched positions. By July 1241, Mongols riding west along the north bank of the Danube reached the Duchy of Austria. Austria's Duke, Friedrich, defeated some Mongol parties, in the process making a fascinating capture: an Englishman, banished from England around 1220, who had wandered east, developed a skill for languages, and eventually made his way into Mongol service, where he was richly rewarded for his talents. He was sent as an envoy to King Bela at least twice, before meeting his fate in Austria. However, finding resistance stiff, and yet still unable to find an unguarded crossing point over the Danube River, the Mongols soon turned away from the Austrian border. To terrify the defenders on the west side of the Danube, the Mongols piled bodies of the slain on the east bank, and were said to have speared small children on lances and paraded them like fish on a spit. Waiting for the river to freeze, Mongol forces were left to harass central and eastern Hungary for the remainder of 1241. the winter of 1241 to 1242 was brutally cold, exacerbating the famine and suffering in eastern Hungary. The few fords and ferries over the Danube River were guarded by Hungarian defenders on the river's west bank, but as the temperature dropped precipitously and ice began to form on the river, it became increasingly hard to guard the full length of the mighty river. Over the following days, a competition began. The Hungarians desperately sought to break the ice, while the Mongols sought a crossing point. Despite the efforts of the defenders, the Danube froze around Christmas 1241. To test the ice, the Mongols left a group of horses unguarded on the east side of the river, in full view of the Hungarian defenders. When the Mongols saw the Hungarians cross over the ice to lead the horses back over the river, they knew it was safe to cross. Batu and Subadai then took their riders over the river, falling on the untouched western edge of Hungary. Once more, unfortified sites and villages suffered greatly from Mongol riders. But here the terrain was more rugged, fortifications more common, and the Hungarians had time to improve defences and plans. Refugees from the east brought with them stories of all the terror they had faced, and in response, defences had been improved and repaired. In the first days of 1242, Batu directed his energies against Esztergom, the kingdom's preeminent political and religious centre. Hungarian prisoners were sent forward to build a wall of bundles of twigs before the moat to screen 30 Mongol siege engines. The city's population felt confident behind their moats, walls, and wooden towers, but this quickly changed once the Mongols unleashed a barrage of artillery on the city. Day and night, stones lobbed from the catapults in an unceasing shower toppled the towers and crashed into homes within the city. Next, the machines hurled bags of dirt into the moat. The garrison was unable to clear it due to the precision of Mongol archers. Steadily, a path was being made over the moat, which the Mongols would soon cross. Once it was apparent that the walls of Esztergom would be breached, the townsfolk set fire to the suburbs, destroyed the fine fabrics, buried gold and silver, killed horses, and hid everything of value. They then retreated to the citadel on the hill. Batu was furious as the riches of Esztergom went up in flames before him, but his efforts to take his wrath out on the city's population were denied. Esztergom's citadel was perched on a high rocky outcrop, and the citadel itself was made of stone. This formidable site was surrounded with wooden palisades, but even these did not fall to the Mongols. This is thanks to a Spaniard named Simon, who led a skilled defense with able ballistarians, either referring to crossbowmen or counter siege engines that kept the Mongols at bay. Batu had the citadel surrounded with his own wooden palisade and tried to assault it, but Simon's defense repelled them. Perhaps with good reason, in the years following the invasion, it became a commonly held belief in Europe that crossbows were a weapon feared by the Mongols. To best understand why Esztergom was such a formidable target, it was best to take a look at it ourselves.
Yoshka, it looks like we've come to the climax of the Mongol invasion of Hungary. We have Esztergom's castle in the background, and down here is what would have been part of the town.
Yes, so in a way, it's end of a story. It's certainly a turning point. The actual capital, with the archbishop, with the head of the Hungarian church as well, was Esztergom. So to siege and capture Esztergom was a crucial issue. But as you mentioned, the Mongol army managed to conquer, siege, and destroy the urban settlements below the castle. And there was a large massacre here. But what we see behind us, that's the citadel, the castle hill. And this castle hill has got very good geographical position. It was situated on top of a hill, and this slope, the natural conditions protected the castle quite well. Then it had also significant walls. What we see walls now, some of them are not from the 13th century, but the basic element of this fortification wall goes back to 11th, very much to 12th century, and then 13th century. There's a huge tower at the corner, which is indicated by this modern reconstruction, which was probably the largest donjon of the kingdom,
So
also surrounded by other walls.
Not unlike Visegrad.
Yeah, it's something, the scale and the size and the importance of Visegrad, but here surrounded by a curtain wall and also protected by the slope of the hill itself.
Would this fortress have been a symbol of Hungarian resistance at the time?
Absolutely, because it was the seat of the king, it was the seat of the archbishop.
So we can't get into Batu's mind too much, but he may have been concerned about the loss of prestige and the loss of a perception of Mongol invincibility if he could not take this castle.
Yes, it was prestige, it was symbolic, but it was more than that. We think that there was a large military group which was in the castle. We probably have members of the religious military orders, also the special group with the leadership of Simon, and the very well trained, part of the very well trained royal army. So if you have got these people, you are not able to conquer this place, you can feel these people can anytime attack your back when you try to conquer the rest of the kingdom.
The Chinese catapults the Mongols utilized were effective against walls of pounded earth, common in China and Central Asia. They were also highly effective against earthworks and wooden walls, as used among the Rus principalities. A stone-walled fortress, however, was a tougher nut to crack. The Chinese catapult was a traction catapult, sometimes called a mangonel, and was operated entirely by manpower. Large teams of men, each holding a rope, pulled on one end of the catapult arm, thus propelling the given projectile. Such a machine was, comparatively speaking, easy to build and take apart, and could be fired relatively quickly. To increase the velocity of the projectile, it was a matter of increasing the size of both the team and the machine. However, their range and strength were less than the cunningly designed counterweight trebuchet, which had begun to appear in the 13th century. The Mongols would, in time, require these counterweight trebuchets to take the greatest of Song dynasty fortifications, Xiangyang, as the classic traction catapult proved insufficient to the task of those mighty walls and their wide moats. Likewise, it seems stone fortifications, which in Central Europe were often built on high points, difficult to access, proved beyond the means of the traction catapult to bring down at a suitable pace for the fast-moving Mongol army. Esztergom's outer walls had fallen, its suburbs destroyed, but the stone central citadel withstood their efforts. If, indeed, the defenders had their own counter-batteries, Batu may have been infuriated to watch his own men and machines be targeted by enemy catapults for the first time, or to see crossbowmen punch holes through their armor and deny their scaling ladders. Batu was in a foul mood. When 300 ladies from Esztergom's citadel came out in their finest clothes to beg for mercy, Batu ordered them robbed and decapitated, before finally leaving the city. Nothing stood of Esztergom except the citadel, the surrounding suburbs a smouldering ruin. Székesfehérvár, one of the kingdom's chief cities, similarly withstood a brutal assault. Everything outside the city walls was obliterated, but the able garrison, possibly a group of Hospitaller knights, built their own siege weapons to counter those of the Mongols. The siege lasted only a few days, before the Mongols moved on. Part of the reason, it seems, was that the marshy ground around the city, inundated by the approaching snow and ice melt, would have left them trapped in the mud. At the castle of St. Martin of Pannonia, here too the Mongols called off the assault, though for unclear reasons. The ferocious pace with which the Mongols had taken cities in eastern Hungary was not repeated in the western part of the kingdom, where the enemy refused to meet the Mongols in the open field. With depleted numbers, Batu may have lacked the will to conduct prolonged bloody sieges, his siege weapons struggling against stout stone walls. With the garrisons refusing to rush out for feigned retreats, Batu found his operational abilities reduced. Still, it must not be thought this meant the western half of the kingdom was spared. Master Roger states in his account that Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, and St. Martin of Pannonia were the only 3 sites that, when laid to siege, held out against the Mongols. At the end of March 1242 comes the most controversial topic of the campaign. As his forces met without success in sieges in western Hungary beyond the Danube, Batu ordered the withdrawal of Mongol armies. Despite it being popularly claimed that the Mongol army hurried to get out of Europe, this does not describe what appears in the sources. There was no mad rush to escape Hungary. The churchman Master Roger was still in Mongol service at this point, and in his record, he states that up until the moment the withdrawal began, he had been under the impression Germany was to be the next target. Roger then describes the withdrawal as slow, loaded with booty, weapons, herds of cattle and sheep. They methodically searched hiding places and forests to find both persons and goods the Mongols had missed in their first advance. Upon returning to Transylvania, where the rugged region and thick forests provided much cover for survivors, and castles had since been refortified, Batu ordered a renewed onslaught. Roger states succinctly, "With exception of a few castles, they occupied the whole country, and as they passed through, they left the country desolate and empty." Batu reached Bulgaria, where Tsar Ivan Asen II had died in July 1241. Leaving only young heirs and anarchy to succeed him. Here in Bulgaria, Batu's force reunited with Haddan, who, after losing King Bela in the Adriatic, had burnt a swath through Serbia to reunite with his kin in Bulgaria. With Bulgaria already in chaos, the Mongols were adding fuel to the fire, greatly destabilizing it further. In the opinion of some historians, Bulgaria submitted to them at this point, though argument is also made for a later date. A Mongol army even reached the borders of the Latin Empire of Constantinople in Thrace, where Emperor Baldwin II was perhaps pulled into a feigned retreat. Though he survived, rumour spread around Europe that he had been killed in combat. Baldwin, it must be noted, had granted shelter to Cumans fleeing Hungary, a cardinal sin in the eyes of the Mongols. The attack seems to have been limited. Nonetheless, Baldwin must have felt he was in a tenuous position, with Mongols on his northern border and soon on his eastern, with another Mongol general, Baiju, simultaneously subjugating the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. Before they re-entered the steppe, the Mongols began reducing rations for their many prisoners, Rus, Hungarian and Cuman alike. At this juncture, anticipating the worst, Master Roger fled into the woods, while pretending to answer the call of nature. The prisoners were told they may return home. The jubilant crowd made it several kilometers down the path before the Mongols rode them down for sport. Once crossing the Carpathians after the slaughter, Batu's route was still slow, allowing men and horses to rest after years of hard campaigning. In Halych-Volhynia, Batu sent forces to put down rebelling boyars and to search for Knyaz Danilo Romanovich, who had escaped them during the first passage through the region. Later in the year, Batu sent his younger brother, Singha, to lead Mongol forces in the suppression of a Kipchak rebellion, pursuing them all the way to the northern Caucasus. Batu and his army wintered in that same region, before marching north. In 1243, the host reached the Volga River, where he set up his encampment. Batu never returned to Mongolia, but steadily over the following years Portions of the Great Army, including Subutai, permanently left Batu to return home. Before their separation, according to the Yuan Shi, Batu forgave Subutai for the bungled operations at Mohi. The two never met again. Subutai would go on a final campaign against the Song dynasty in China before dying of old age in 1248.
But Batu, he seems to have not really gone on any major campaigns after this. He stayed at the Volga. He was enemies with Guyuk Khan in Mongolia. So once Guyuk became the new Khan in 1246, Batu had to be on guard. He suspected Guyuk was going to try and eliminate him by one way or another, including military force. So he wasn't really going on any major expeditions to the west. And we don't even know the circumstances in which Batu died.
In the end, Batu received what he wanted. He was the second most powerful man in the empire after the Great Khan. He was undisputed master of the western quarter of the Mongol Empire, establishing the heart of his appanage along the Volga. He strengthened Mongol hold over the Rus and collected taxes from most of the Mongols' Middle Eastern lands. In his final years, he helped his cousin Meng Ke take the imperial throne. He and Meng Ke practically divided the empire between them. By the time of his death in the mid-1250s, Batu had achieved his goal of legitimacy and security for the House of Jochi. For Batu's own heirs, his immediate son and grandson who succeeded him died in unclear circumstances. This was likely organized by Batu's brother Berke, who rose to power as the first Muslim Mongol Khan. Batu's descendants continued to rule in those lands. After Meng Ke's death in 1259, Batu's family became independent, establishing what became known to history as the Golden Horde.
So there are four theories for the Mongol withdrawal, what could have caused it. The most popular theory is that the Great Khan of Mongolia died in 1241, and the Mongol princes would have had to go back to Mongolia to take part in a Hariltai to choose the next Khan. There's another theory, though, which developed in the last few decades that blames it on the environment. Maybe the Mongols encountered bad weather, excess rain and cold, and they were having some issues with feeding either themselves or their animals. So it could have been a sort of ecological issue, which wouldn't have gone down recorded in history, but we'd just get hints. For instance, some scholars have said that Hungary couldn't possibly sustain the number of livestock and horses that a Mongol army would require to occupy it. Another theory is that the Mongol invasion in 1241-42 was not actually intended as a permanent conquest. It was a raid to soften up the territory so that Bela IV would submit without fighting when he's threatened in the future. And if so, that strategy almost worked. But then there's also theories that argue that the Mongols were encountering a pretty serious military problem, whether it be the stone castles built on elevated sites that we read from the sources were able to hold out against the Mongol siege, or the strong armies that were still in the region. And the Mongols themselves may just not have had the manpower necessary to carry out the task. And though it's often disregarded, some historians point out the threat of a crusade forming in Western Europe and the possibility of a counterattack against the Mongols in Hungary. But the Mongols keep their plans very secret. They were extremely secretive. And so they've left this lingering mystery 800 years later.
Often the withdrawal in 1242 is presented as the end of the Mongol-European interactions, the Mongols disappearing into the mists of the east. But this is far from the fact of the matter. In the years following the first invasion, Mongol and European contacts increased. The European lords, desiring to learn more about this foe and the potential for their return, began sending envoys east. Their missions were to gather as much information as possible on the Khans. The most well-known of these was the Franciscan friar John de Plano Carpini. He arrived in Mongolia in time for the coronation of Ugedei's son and successor, Guyuk, in 1246. Carpini returned to Europe soon after, bearing with him an account of his travels. It contained detailed observations about Mongolian life and culture, and what he believed was necessary to fight them. Accompanying him was a letter of submission from Guyuk, demanding that the Pope and monarchs of Europe come to submit to him in person. As Carpini indicated, the Mongols were very much planning another attack on Europe, one Guyuk seemed willing to lead himself. Evidently, nothing they had faced in Hungary and Poland in 1241–42 had truly frightened them off. Carpini's suggestions for battling the Mongols included an imitation of much of their army's structure and tactics, indicating the effect these had had upon the Europeans. Guyuk's planned return to Europe never materialized. His reign was cut short 2 years later with his sudden death, putting the Mongol Empire into another operational pause, until the election of Mengke as Great Khan at the start of the 1250s. Under Mengke, letters of submission continued to be sent to Europe, demanding their surrender. Mengke, though, seemed to desire the completion of the conquest of China and the Islamic world before returning to Europe. European matters instead fell to Mengke's deputies ruling the western steppes, first Batu and then to his brother Berke. Not only did they continue to threaten European monarchs, but also attempted other means to woo them. King Bela IV reported in his letters to the Pope that he had received letters from the Mongols offering a marriage alliance in exchange for his submission. Around 1270, the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII married off one of his daughters to the Mongol Prince Nogai, indicating the idea was not too foreign for them either. But the Western Mongols were not afraid to use force when it suited them. Batu and Berke ordered military operations into the still independent Halych Volhynia to bring it finally under their suzerainty. And in May 1259, Mongol armies once more again attacked Poland, ravaging across the duchies in a campaign that the later chronicler Jan Dlugosz dubbed more destructive than the first. In what is now Romania and Bulgaria, Prince Nogai began extending Mongol rule there, in time bringing most of the lower Danube under their influence. Part of the reason for this seems to be that with the breakup of the Mongol Empire into independent khanates after 1260, the new Northwestern Division, what we call the Golden Horde, was initially too busy. It was caught up in warfare with its cousins turned rivals, particularly the Ilkhanate. The eruption of the volcano Samalas in Indonesia in the 1250s may have brought about environmental stresses in the Eurasian steppes, bringing a level of economic and political instability to the Golden Horde and other khanates that discouraged foreign ventures on the scale of earlier conquests. Hungary was expected to be a strong target, and the Khans of the Golden Horde were unwilling to devote strength to the task of another invasion. It took until 1285 for Mongol armies to return to Hungary in force.
So-called Second Tatar invasion, which took part in 1285, was led by Nogai, who was actually a chief of the Golden Horde and for some time even a pretender usurper. This second Tatar or Mongol invasion wasn't so important, although there were real fears on the part of the Hungarians and other Central European nations.
Hungary, though, was largely spared attacks, aside from the possibility of small raids, according to some accounts. This was fortunate for the Hungarians, who were given valuable breathing room to rebuild in the wake of the disaster. When Bela returned to his realm later in 1242, he was horrified at the level of devastation. East of the Danube River, the destruction was extensive. much of the land of the Hungarian plain was depopulated, its people having been exterminated or having fled into western and southern parts of the kingdom. Bela had little doubt that the Mongols would soon come to finish the job, and in short order he set about trying to prepare his kingdom for such an event. One of his first actions was to bring the Cumans who had fled Hungary back into his kingdom. He offered them lands in the now depopulated Hungarian basin. The lands granted to them are still known as Cumania, the Nagykunság and Kiskunság in Hungary. Today in that region, a museum stands to commemorate the community's place in Hungarian history.
So when the whole Mongol invasion was over, when the Mongol army withdrew and King Bela IV returned, there was a task to repopulate these areas, the most heavily destroyed areas of the kingdom, which was in the Great Plain, in the eastern part of the country.
Who did they find that would be willing to come out and live here?
There was a special group of people who already before the Mongol invasion wanted to come, and actually they came to Hungary and they wanted to settle here. They were the Cumans, Kipchaks, because they were running away from the Mongols. They were defeated by the Mongol army earlier, and they didn't want to be suppressed by the Mongol Empire.
So they were basically a steppe people who came into the Kingdom of Hungary because they'd been displaced from their homeland?
Exactly, this is the case. So they were refugees. They were running away from the eastern steppe region, and they wanted to settle in Hungary. Bela IV invited them to stay there, but because there was an initial phase of the settlement which created conflicts, one of the leaders was killed, they ran out of the country. They went to the Balkan. But later, in the 50s, they returned, and actually they were settled in the area which became empty because of the Mongol invasion.
So I guess they got it right the second time. The first attempt at a Hungarian-Cuman alliance didn't work, but ultimately it was at least successful in the sense that the Cumans settled here.
That's true. They settled there. They created Cumania, what we call in Hungarian Kiskunság, Nagykunság, the small Cumania and the big Cumania. They had a privileged position. They received not individual privilege, but they received community privilege. And they lived there in the next few centuries. And even today, these areas are called Kunság, and people living here, they still got some kind of Cuman identity.
Bela also tied them closer to his dynasty by arranging a marriage between his son and heir, István, and a Cuman princess, who was then baptized and renamed Elizabeth. With these grants, the Cumans were expected to be the kingdom's first line of defense should the Mongols return, and Cuman troops accompanied Bela on his campaigns over the following years. After the death of the troublesome Duke Friedrich of Austria in 1246, Bela sought to expand into Austrian territory. Bela envisioned making the Danube River a fortified line of defense. Given that most of the kingdom's population now lived to the west of it, Bela hoped to extend his kingdom further west, in effect putting more land between him and the Mongols. These efforts were halted, however, by Bela's defeat against the Bohemians at the Battle of Kressenbrunn in 1260. Still, Bela had other strategies he could use, ones that utilized his own family, his kingdom's natural geography, and new fortifications. Much of this is embodied by Margaret's Island, lying in the Danube between Buda and Pest, and named for one of Bela's daughters, Saint Margaret.
Bela IV left the Battle of Muhi and he fled through his country. One of the darkest days of the invasion, they promised to God that they will give their newborn daughter to the god. She became a nun if the Mongols leave the country. And on January, a baby was born. She was called to Margaret after her sister who died recently. And in March, the Mongols left the country. Margaret became a nun. She was raised as a nun from her childhood, firstly in Veszprém, and then the royal couple built a monastery in the Margaret Island, which was called differently at that time. It was the Island of Rabbits. The Dominican nuns lived there, and Margaret was raised there, and she became a Dominican nun.
We're standing on Margaret Island, and this place seems to have been like the front line, in a way, of the Mongol invasion for about 10 months, if I'm right, because the Mongols could not cross the Danube River. On the east side, they could destroy Pest, and then on the west side, there's Buda that they couldn't reach, and in the middle of the river, there's this large island. And doesn't it have buildings connected to the Mongol invasion?
Yes, you are right. So the Margaret Island was on the front line because the Danube was a kind of natural barrier between the Mongol army and the Hungarian army during the winter of 1241. And there were some buildings built before the Mongol invasion. Probably one of the buildings which we can see here now, which is not as it looked like in the 1230s, 40s, 50s. It's a neo-Romanesque reconstruction of a Premonstratensian monastery.
So basically in modern times they rebuilt a monastery?
Yeah, it was a result of some archaeological excavations. They found some traces, and it was rebuilt as a chapel, not as a proper monastery. But there were other buildings on the island which were built after the Mongol invasion as a kind of response to the Mongol invasion. And this is very interesting because it's a whole sequence of buildings. Towards the north, we had a castle of the Archbishop of Esztergom. There are no visible traces of that today. Then we had this Premonstratensian site where you see this small chapel today. Then there is the big Dominican nunnery, the place where Saint Margaret lived in her life. Saint Margaret was born during the Mongol invasion.
And Saint Margaret was, of course, Bela IV's daughter, who'd been donated, as it were, to the church if God delivered Hungary from the so-called Tartars.
Yes, exactly. And there was also a Franciscan friary further down to the south. And at the very southern end of the island, there was the castle of the Order of St. John. So it's a kind of religious military order fortification, a pretty important one, which shows that there were two important castles at the end of the island, one at the north, one at the south. And this clearly indicates the military importance of the island, at least indicates how important it was in the plans of Bela IV, the plans which emerged after the Mongol invasion as a response to it, and to understand the situation that the Mongols will come back and we should do something against this.
So basically they had made this the front and center of a sort of river Danube defense line.
Absolutely.
Margaret's Island was far from being the only part of the Danube frontier Bela fortified in this manner. At Visegrad, a short drive north from Budapest, more of Bela's plans can still be seen even 800 years later.
Here we have Visegrad, and north of here, around the bend of the Danube River, which you can see quite well,
there was Esztergom with its castle and its city. And then farther to the south, down the Danube River, you had the third linchpin of this defense line, which was the new Buda, the fortified town that would become the capital of the Hungarian kingdom. Is that correct?
Yes, so these are the most important elements of this castle system. As you said, Esztergom, which was there before and which was able to resist the Mongol invasion, at least the upper part, the castle itself. Then Visegrad with its two new castles, which were constructed right after the Mongol invasion. One of them is the lower castle where we are standing now, and the other is the upper castle, which was imagined as a refugium for the nuns of the Margaret Island and for Margaret herself in case of a second Mongol invasion. The way of thinking of Bela IV was, in a way, very similar how to protect the country. So the lessons, what he has learned from the first Mongol invasion, 1241-42, one, that the Danube was used as a natural border. The second lesson was that the Mongols are not able to control the country, the kingdom, until all castles are not sieged and occupied by them. And these strong stone castles, particularly which are on hilltops, like the one in Visegrad, takes an extremely long time, requires huge military forces, war machines, siege machines, and so on, to attack it and to siege it. And that hinders an invading army to go fast. So it's not like the Great Plain, that they were able to conquer the small fortifications very quickly. This would be a big obstacle for them to conquer it.
A castle like this, like Visegrad, built in the 1200s, it looks like a lot of work. How did this castle building policy work?
So there were private castles, private stone castles built before 1241, but the number of them was much smaller than the castles which were built after this. The king, first of all, offered his own personal example, so he himself built castles, or, for example, the Visegrad Upper Castle was built from the money and jewelry of the queen. But King Bela IV decided to donate land to members of the nobility on a condition that they will build stone castles. But it was also the interest of these families, because it was clear if you have got such stone castles, you can survive better a possible second Mongol invasion. And this is also important in the context of other fortifications, like Esztergom, because Esztergom survived the first Mongol invasion, at least the castle, not the fortified town. So it shows that such a place with a strong stone fortification can be a safe place in an invasion. And so Esztergom example was used to build a new big center, which was the castle and the fortified town of Buda.
Bela also wanted to ensure his kingdom would not be isolated again in the face of an invasion. He created a network of marriage alliances with Polish dukes, the Duke of Bavaria, the King of Bohemia, and the princes of Halych-Volhynia. With Rus princes who had fled into Hungary, he appointed them as governors on his southern border along the Danube, smaller fiefdoms to guard that frontier. With Halych-Volhynia, Bela offered encouragement for its ruler, Daniel Romanovich, to declare his independence from the Mongols as King of Ruthenia, making a convenient buffer state between Hungary and the Mongol Empire. He continued to beseech the popes to call for crusades and for other aid, presenting himself as the protector of Christendom, its first line of defense against the Mongol menace. In these letters, Bela also complained of the money and effort going into crusades elsewhere, such as King Louis IX of France's failed invasion of Egypt in 1250. Though the popes and other prelates bemoaned Bela's willingness to ally with non-Christian Cumans, Bela argued that in the face of poor support from the rest of Europe, he had to do what was necessary to protect his kingdom. He went so far as to insinuate that he may even have needed to accept Mongol rule and offers of a marriage alliance if European support continued to be withheld. Papal patience waned to the point that they actively told Bela he would receive no help from them, and Hungary's suffering had been on account of their sins. Bela's efforts were aided greatly by the fact that no second Mongol attack was immediately forthcoming. He faced civil war with his son Istvan in the last years of his life, placing his kingdom once more on precarious footing. But fortunately for him, the Golden Horde did not take advantage of it. Argument has been made that Bela took part in some sort of unofficial submission, paying a tribute to the Mongols to placate them, though no direct evidence for this assertion is available. Regardless, by the time of his death in early 1270, Bela had shepherded in a period of renewal, strength, and relative stability. For this reason, he is seen as a second founder of the Hungarian kingdom, taking it from one of its lowest points back to a footing of power.
As for somebody who had a quite significant political achievement, his political concept was quite different before and after the Mongol invasion. Learning the lesson of the Mongol invasions, in the first years of his rule, Bela IV made very significant attempts to regain landed estates which were earlier donated to local landlords all over the country. And this way it created a kind of conflict between the dominating noble families and the king himself. And perhaps as the lesson of the Mongol invasion, he realized that he couldn't defend the country in the case of a second invasion, only with help of the ruling influential families as well.
His work laid the foundation for a kingdom that would be able to stand when Mongol armies once again crossed the Carpathians in 1285. But that is a story perhaps for another day. For every land that suffered a Mongol invasion, that period became a defining moment in their history. For the Hungarians, this was no exception. Tartárjáros, as it is called in Hungarian, conjures a clear image to the Magyars today, a period of utter destruction and terror, yet one that they recovered from, as they could other disasters which befell them. The Mongol invasion is a boundary marker in Hungarian history, considered so even in the Middle Ages. It led to a massive reorganization of the Hungarian kingdom and its people that permanently changed it.
In the whole Carpathian Basin, you can find memories about Tatar invasion. What is interesting, the name of natural and man-made relief forms, landmarks that are associated with campaigns and bear the name that is connected to Tatars or that is connected to massacres that happened at that place.
It's really a part of the Hungarian culture because somehow the Hungarians like to see their history as a continuation of tragedies. And one of the biggest tragedy is the Mongols.
So what does it mean for you as a Hungarian coming back to this site?
So for me personally, of course, it makes a big difference that I came to this place quite often as a historian, as an archaeologist. But of course, for any ordinary visitor, visitors of these sites from Hungary, this is a very important national memorial place. There are two very important battles in Hungarian history, two turning points. One of them is the Battle of Muhi, 1241. The other is the Battle of Mohács, 1526, which was against the Ottoman army. And in both cases, the defeat, the result of this battle, created a situation which lasted for centuries. So it's not simply that, okay, it's one of those battles, but it's one of those events in a history of a nation, of a country, of a kingdom, which affected almost everything. Not just individual lives, social history, economic history, political life, and things like that. So when people are coming here, obviously they are confronted with something what they have learned in elementary school, what they memorized in some way. Not so much the details, that's more for historians, archaeologists, but the very fact that there was an important turning point in our history.
For the Mongol Empire, the invasion was the furthest west their forces would travel. The entire campaign was a test of Mongol armies, expanding their empire immensely, but sowing seeds that would later contribute to the empire's dissolution, deepening tensions between major members of the family and creating a power base for the Khans of the Golden Horde to stay out of reach of the influence of the Great Khan. The Mongol invasion caused a dramatic displacement of people across the steppes, utterly transforming Kipchak society. While the Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde would eventually adopt Kipchak languages and convert to Islam, their Chinggisid identity never dissipated, and descent from Chinggis Khan remained the defining means of societal organization in the region until conquest by the Russian Empire. Mongol rule over the Rus continued for centuries, and over the 14th century saw repeated conflicts with the Hungarians over their shared border. After the collapse of the Golden Horde, the frontier then saw fighting between the Horde's successors, the Crimean Khans.
Another aspect of research should be emphasized here, the intensive role of responsible metal detecting. Volunteers using the device conduct their surveys under the control of the museums. There has been an incredible growth in the number of new findings, of new discoveries, and the involvement of civilians impacted archaeological research in a very positive way.
I think the most characteristic feature of the new research which is going on, we carried out a research project for the last 4 years, and we will continue this, is the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary character of these projects. So we are talking about the cooperation of many scholars. There are archaeologists, historians, art historians, specialists of Oriental studies, numismats, geographers, specialists of remote sensing and things like that. Because only in this way we can give a new reading to the textual evidence, but also we can collect a very important new source material, which is all archaeology.
Even 8 centuries later, the Mongol invasion of Central Europe in 1241 remains a well-known and well-studied historical episode. Yet every year, new information and new means of study shed more light on this legendary event that continually improves our knowledge and refines our understanding of it. New sources, new technologies, and new theories will continue to advance the story in the years to come. From Asia's Pacific coastline to the Mediterranean, the legacy of the Mongol Empire runs deep and continues to fascinate. Though the invasions of Hungary and Poland were only one small part of this story, the names of the actors within it, Bela, Batu, Subutai, and more, continue to cast long shadows over the march of history.